Good afternoon, everyone. We might start today's special meeting. Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. Welcome members of the public, to which this is live streamed the meeting, and members of the gallery and staff. I'll also like to acknowledge the Mayor and my colleague councillors in the room, the Planning and Development General Manager, Nicola, and the CEO, Brian. Thanks for your attendance this afternoon. Firstly, before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse the lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guyabal and Jarowa peoples, and pay respects to their elders past and present. And just by way of explanation around some songlines, I think it's important for us to remember and acknowledge, because it's very relevant to us today around our connection, First Nations peoples' connection, and songlines were much more than depicted in artwork. They were a story and a connection to everything around them. And we're not dissimilar in the room here today. In fact, communities can't exist in isolation. We are all connected to each other in one way, shape or form. And I won't give you a history lesson, but I think it's really important for us to just acknowledge why we're all here and what we can achieve when we realise that connection. And I know my First Nations forefathers and forebears very much understood their connection to land, and not just in a physical sense, but everything around them. So thank you for your indulgence in that. So if we move on, I'd like to attend to the attendance and apologies and leaves of absence, granting of leave of absence, declarations of conflicts of interest. There's no known. Councillor Megan is an apology for today. So we're all here, the rest of us. There's no leave that we know of. Anyone wanting to request leave? We have one declaration of conflicts of interest. Councillor Melissa, would you like to? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I inform this meeting that I have a declarable conflict of interest in this matter as defined in Section 150 EN of the Local Government Act 2009. The nature of my interest is as follows. This declarable conflict of interest arises because I have had a recent phone call from Brendan Collins in regards to this development application, who is listed as an involved party in Attachment 1 for Item 4, RAL-2022-2081, development application for a development permit for reconfiguring a lot, impact 2 lots into 12 lots located at 345 to 357 Rowbotham Street and 510 Mackenzie Street, Middle Ridge. I also attended early years primary school with Brendan Collins, but have had no personal relationships with him since. I wish to participate in the decision in relation to this matter. I acknowledge that eligible councillors must now determine, pursuant to Section 150 ES of the Local Government Act 2009, whether I, 1, may participate in the decision about the matter, including by voting on the matter, 2, must leave the meeting, including any area set aside for the public, and stay away from the meeting while the eligible councillors discuss and vote on the matter, or 3, may participate in the decision about the matter subject to conditions. If I may,
yes,
Chair, thank you. I will just clarify further that upon receiving a phone call from Brendan and reintroducing himself to me, because I haven't spoken to Brendan for 30 years. Don't want to disclose how long it's been since I've been in primary school. I did precede the conversation saying that I will just be listening and making no comments as I didn't want to prejudice myself with today's vote. And he just wanted to ensure that I had read all the documents and really just asking if I had any questions. So that was, other than asking about each other's family's health, that's about the extent of the conversation.
Thanks, Councillor Mel. Councillor Rebecca.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Taylor. We get phone calls from people involved with applications that are going to be considered by council every month, and we understand that we hear those conversations, we take into considerations what is said to us, but we don't prejudice our positions and give any undertaking to how we're going to vote. So I first of all don't think it's necessary for Councillor Taylor to have made that declaration. But the question now is, Councillor Taylor, did you give any sort of undertaking that you feel you have prejudiced your vote?
No.
I don't believe Councillor Taylor has a conflict. After the questions have been asked, I'm happy to so move.
Councillor Taylor, and then Councillor Tim.
Not in this relation to this, Mr. Chair, but I've also, as Councillor Rebecca said, you have a lot of phone calls and people don't understand you can't discuss something that's the subject of a development application, but that's exactly what I've told them, and so I think in this case I agree with Councillor Rebecca that I don't believe that there's any conflict of interest there, so thank you. And if there were, I mean, I didn't go to school with anyone, but I'm like friends with them, but I've had a call and I didn't comment in any way either for or against. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Tim, same thing.
Yeah, Chair, look, I've had phone calls from the involved parties in item 8 today, and I think most around the table have, as well as many emails, so I don't think a phone call from a 30-year-old colleague is perhaps much
Look,
to
given
worry.
that Councillor Melissa's felt to make a declaration, if you're happy to move, Councillor Rebecca, Councillor Tim second. Any other questions, councillors? No? Let's vote on that, that she doesn't have a conflict. That's unanimous. Thanks, Councillor Mel. Let's move on. I now move to item 3 on the list here, suspension of standing orders for item 4, RAL-2022-2081 development application for a development permit for reconfiguring a lot, impact 2 lots into 12 located at 345 to 357 Rowbottom Street and 510 Mackenzie Street, Middle Ridge. Can I have someone move? Councillor Tim and Councillor Paul, or the Mayor. Second, those in favour? It's carried. So with that, I would like to ask the officer, Emily, if she would like to come. Oh, she's already here. Over to you, Emily, and she'll run us through that, and then we'll go. We'll have a presentation by 2 submitters this afternoon, and I understand there's some overhead or. Yep. Okay. Right, over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Good afternoon, councillors. The report presents the assessment of a development application for reconfiguring a lot at 345 to 357 Rowbotham Street and 510 Mackenzie Street. The proposed subdivision seeks to create a total of 12 additional lots for residential purposes, ranging in size from 968 metres squared to 2,470 metres squared. The subject site is located within the rural residential zone within the 4,000 metre squared minimum precinct of the Toowoomba Regional Planning Scheme. Given the proposed lot sizes do not meet the minimum lot area of 4,000 metres squared intended within the zoning, the application is impact accessible. Please note that in attachment 1 involved parties, Jeanette Loxton's name should be included as a submitter as she provided a joint submission with Toby Loxton. Further, within attachment 5, there are a number of landscaping plans which include a detention basin. Just to clear that up, these plans have been recommended to be amended to remove the detention basin and reflect the allotment layout plan which has been recommended for approval. Where assessing the proposed lot sizes, consideration has been given to the purpose of the Rural Residential Zone Code, which is to provide for residential development on lots where local government infrastructure and services may not be provided and where the intensity of residential development is generally dispersed. The proposed development is capable of being fully serviced by council's infrastructure and is located within the priority infrastructure area of the local government infrastructure plan. Kirsten, would you be able to bring up attachment 4, figure 2? Yes. So as you can see here, the site adjoins land in the low density zone immediately to the north. The zoning is also located directly to the east and northeast of the subject site on the opposite side of Mackenzie Street. So that's all that light pink pictured up there. The site also adjoins land in the rural residential zone in the brown to the northeast and south. Given the development can be fully serviced, it is considered that the subject site is appropriately located to provide a smooth transition within the streetscape between the existing low-density residential zoning and the rural residential zoning in the surrounding area. Kirsten, could we please bring up attachment 5? Just that first page, yeah. So the proposed lot layout is considered to provide for this transition, noting that the smaller lots are contained on the Mackenzie Street side of the development adjoining the opposite low-density residential zoning, which is intended for lots with a minimum area of 500 metres squared. The 3 larger lots within the subdivision are located along the Rowbotham Street frontage between 2 other lots contained within the rural residential zone. The proposed lots provide frontages of 34.1 metres to 52.8 metres, consistent with other lot frontages along Rowbotham Street within 100 metres of the subject site. Assessment of the application concludes that the proposed lots are of an appropriate size and shape to allow future dwellings to provide sufficient setbacks which allow for acceptable residential amenity and privacy on site and for adjoining properties. Additionally, it is considered that the proposed lot layout is consistent with the existing streetscapes on both Mackenzie and Rowbotham Street and compatible with the established density of housing within the locality. It is further noted that there are existing concerns regarding the street trees located along the Rowbotham Street frontage. The development seeks to remove trees to allow for 2 vehicular crossovers which will provide access for lots 10 to 11 and lot 12. An arborist report has been provided with the application which identifies that the trees to be removed are of fair to poor health and form and have areas of major deadwood. Further, one of the trees to be removed is identified as dead in the arborist report. Rowbotham Street is also identified as a distributor road, which requires a road reserve width of 25 metres and 2 footpaths in accordance with the requirements of Planning Scheme Policy 2. Road widening has been provided along the Rowbotham Street to allow for the 25-metre wide road reserve. Noting that the Rowbotham Street is identified as a trunk road, a footpath and other roadworks along this Rowbotham Street frontage of the site are not recommended to be provided as part of the development. These works can be provided by council at a later date where protection of street trees can be controlled by council. Notwithstanding, the plans have identified that a future footpath can be located along the frontage of the development while maintaining the existing street trees, which would be located between the footpath and the road. It is noted that there have also been concerns raised regarding stormwater discharge of the proposed development. A stormwater management plan has been supplied which identifies a lawful point of discharge through an existing stormwater easement at 18 Nidri Drive. Council's assessing engineers have reviewed the stormwater management plan and it is considered that the stormwater impacts can be appropriately managed by the development. Further, conditions have been recommended requiring the applicant to submit, as part of an application for operational works, a detailed stormwater management plan for approval by council, which will confirm the detailed design of stormwater infrastructure. The application was publicly notified. 2 properly made submissions and 1 not properly made submission were received, all objecting the proposed development. Broadly, the matters raised in submissions included lot sizes, earthworks and retaining walls, amenity and privacy, stormwater, impacts on trees, fauna, light pollution, and impacts on the water and sewer networks. The matters raised in submissions were considered in the assessment of the development application, and further details about the matters raised and the assessing officer's responses to these matters are detailed within the report. The proposed development has been assessed against all relevant assessment benchmarks, including the entire planning scheme to the extent relevant, and the State Planning Policy 2017 as outlined in the report. The proposed development generally complies or could be conditioned to comply with the planning scheme, and as such, the proposed development is recommended to be approved subject to relevant and reasonable conditions.
Thanks, Emily. I was going to say questions before we... Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Kyle, through you. Is there a bond required to be lodged for the widening of the street and the construction of the footpath at a later date, or is that left to the ratepayers of Toowoomba to pick up? Thanks.
We might call upon Adam to respond to that.
A little tall. So the because the through you, Mr. Chair. So the road hierarchy, as it is a distributor, so it would be a trunk road. So we would be paying for that, whether the developer builds it or whether we build it later on. Included in that.
Thanks, Adam. Councillor Rebecca.
Thanks, Chair. I've got quite a few questions, but I'll just start with the first lot of questions and then hand over to my colleagues. And if they haven't been answered, I'll come back to some of the other ones that I've got. So I do want to talk about the stormwater, please. And it is a multifaceted sort of part of what we have to consider here. So we have conditions that are listed pages 32 and 33 of the report. But I just want us to sort of have a conversation at first about this. So there are these conditions, and amongst them it's that a detailed stormwater management plan has to be submitted. That area that the development's at is it's a unique area in that it's at the head of the catchment for two catchments, and the flow of water therefore is really important for us to consider. And naturally that water would go down into the Condamine Ballon catchment, but what's suggested here is that it goes to, that there's a discharge point in Nidri Drive, number 18 I think it is, and there is a condition that number 18 has to be in agreement to this. But I need to understand firstly why Nidri Drive, which is a distance away, when Rowbotham Street is a closer discharge point. So why Nidri? And then if it is Nidri, then we all know that area, and it flows down into Glen Lomond Park. And again, in the report, it talks about that there can't be any worsening of there are environmental requirements that have to be met, but the discharge of that water down into the park, how have we addressed erosion and scouring of the discharge point in the park there? So why Nidri, and what happens then in the park, please, just to get us started. And also, how do we, what's been considered about diverting the water from those two catchments as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So, Nidri Drive was identified through an investigation with our drainage planning branch. So initially the design was to allow detention on site and discharge straight to Robotham Street. The concern we had there, the existing verge profile of Robotham Street wasn't adequate for the stormwater that would be going to that location. There's an existing drainage discharge easement through number 18 Nidri Drive. It was identified the natural flow path was through Glen Park as it was. So it was decided with drainage planning that we'd require stormwater infrastructure from the development to be constructed down Robotham Street, down Nidri Drive, and then through that drainage easement. So with regards to the erosion concerns, it has been conditioned that it will be a detailed design component as part of our operational works application. So we would envision there'll either be rock scour arrangement, or we may go down the path of gabion structures subject to a detailed design. And that'll come down to the stormwater velocity flows and the volumes of water at the time of detailed design. And with regards to the different catchments for the stormwater, the assessing officer at the time had communications with state government regarding the concern about the catchments being diverted, and state's response at the time was the size of the redirection wasn't large enough to be of a concern for them, and they were okay for it to proceed.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much for that. And with the removal of the detention basin, sorry, these things, thank goodness they're mobile. With the removal of the detention basin, and you said it was identified by the council team that, that I forget what your words were, but that it was a superior option to take it to Nidri, but it is still a ways away. It's not on any of our the attachments that are included in that, but even sans the detention basin, why not somewhere on Robotham? I don't understand that.
As in discharge to Robotham, sorry.
Right.
Robotham Street's existing corridor there's no stormwater infrastructure within the road reserve. There's no really defined table drain, so any stormwater we were to discharge to Robotham Street would end up sheet flowing through the adjoining landowners to the east ultimately. And the idea was to try to prevent any additional stormwater flows going through adjoining landowners.
I'm not convinced that we have adequately addressed the issue. I'm concerned that we have relocated the issue somewhere else. But I'll hear from my other colleagues, and there was another point that I was going to make as well, which I've lost. I'll wait, see what others have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, mate. Councillor Melissa.
Thanks, Chair. Just a question about the trees along Robotham Street. I note that it said that the arborists have cited them as dying. Is it? I don't know. I can't remember the actual words that you used.
Fair to poor.
Fair to poor.
Poor health and form. Yeah.
Thank you. I knew I didn't have the correct word, but it's all I could think of. Was the removal of the trees a planning and development requirement, or did the developer ask for the trees to be removed?
Councillor, through the chair, so the trees would be required to be removed for the purposes of the vehicle crossovers by the development. So essentially through the...
So it's a planning scheme that requires the trees to be removed?
No, it's the development itself that requires the trees to be removed to make way for those vehicle crossovers.
So the way that the development has been planned, the trees have to be removed?
Yes,
okay.
that's correct.
And Adam, can I just double check with you, just so I've got it clear in my head, because I actually had the same concern as Councillor Carroll about the footpath. So because of the hierarchy of the road, it is up to council, not the developer, to put in the footpath. Because that's curious.
Yes, that is correct. So if you look at, I don't have it prepared here, but in the charge resolution, there's examples of what is consistent of trunk infrastructure, and then the transport one, footpaths are included in the standard road hierarchy and as part of that. So I would say that, say, a footpath going through a park down, say, along East Creek would not be falling into that same category, whereas one on a higher order road would be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Any further questions, Councillor Jeff?
Thanks, Chair. Through you to Emily. Thank you, Emily. Appreciate the report. Maybe through to the GM, through you, Chair, or to Danielle. Yesterday, Council received approval of our TLPI, Temporary Local Planning Instrument, for areas of rural areas, if you like, rural residential into development. Would this in the PDA and be serviced? Does it sort of fit the same level of criteria because it is serviced and that is in the PDA? Not the PDA, you know what I mean, PIA.
This land, the subject of this application is within the priority infrastructure area,
Yep.
and the TLPI related to land that is currently sitting within the emerging communities zone.
And rural,
And it
yeah.
was intending, I think it was just emerging community zone, and it was intending to apply the residential zoning provisions to development of that land. So it's a little different to here because this zoning is rural residential. So it's a rural residential zoning rather than a low or low medium density residential zone.
I guess the similarities are this is serviced and is within the PIA area.
Yes.
So yeah, okay. The question then is relating to, and it's a question that we're going to discuss, I guess, early in the new year in regard to environmental protection, trees and what have you, and the trees that are on the block of which council has no control over on the private property, and that's where the interest is obviously on street trees and ensuring that we can save as many of those. And I guess I just raise that as a point that is, you know, I've raised concern for community in a variety of parts, but this is the sort of situation we find ourselves in local government, that we don't have jurisdiction over private property in regard to the clearing of trees. The report talks about the transition from low residential into rural, and then in between this is a transition. Keeping that in mind, there is nothing stopping this from continuing, albeit it's got two roads beside it, so it's got a natural buffer. But there's nothing, I'm thinking 20 years down the track. So the blocks that are there now that will be produced at the level that they are could in fact be split if houses are built in a certain way. Is that a risk that we take?
In the future, I guess the subdivision potential would be governed by the planning scheme of the day. So at the moment, as we're talking about this development today, it's zoned rural residential, but in this instance, you've got a transition between the low density and the rural residential. Generally, rural residential zoning reflects a situation where it's not anticipated that land would be fully serviced, more particularly in relation generally to sewer. But in this instance, the land is capable of being fully sewered. In the future, when demand continues or the pressure for infill development, continues to rise, it may be that either this council, because we've got a planning scheme being developed at the moment, or a future council under a future review or a new planning scheme may determine that there's a need or a demand for additional lower density zoned land, in which case council of that day could make a decision either to change or alter the zoning, or as we are here today, considering whether this form of development is appropriate for this site as it's currently zoned.
Thank you. Yeah, we can't sort of look into the crystal ball or suggest what could happen down the track. I get that. In regard to the the earthworks and retaining wall, noting that there's been a change since this was first talked about, and now the retaining walls are under a metre, which I understand from a operational works doesn't need an approval under that limit. The lots that are adjoining this development to the north, the east, and the north again, is there any way within operational works conditions could be where retaining walls and fences are in line, so that there isn't a gap, just from a serviceability of maintaining areas between retaining walls and fence lines?
You could generally, you prefer that a retaining wall generally sits within one lot so it doesn't straddle the boundaries, because then it gives rise to consideration of, well, who's responsible if there is an issue with the retaining wall. So generally you prefer retaining walls to be sitting within one block, which would be, you guess, the blocks are subject of this application if there's a need for retaining. In this instance, through the assessment process, there has been additional information provided which suggests that the retaining walls, and particularly there were concerns raised with the interface with, I think, this lot here, are not proposed to exceed a metre, and that detail of that would generally be considered as part of the detailed design for the operational works. There is the possibility, if there is a particular concern in council, that we could include in this development, if council determined that it wished to approve it, a couple of additional conditions around particularly retaining walls and also batter slopes to Rowbotham Street. So we have prepared a couple of additional potential conditions if that is a particular concern to council that could be included in a potential approval, but yeah, we believe that can be adequately addressed.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. You see some places where, you know, retaining walls here on the boundary, then the fence is there, and therefore the person of which
It's a no man's land.
is and the person of which has nothing to do with the development actually maintains that part of the area sometimes. So fence and retaining wall. But I'd be keen to have a look at what other options there are. But Chair, that's all the only questions I've had. Happy to hear from the submitters both. Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor Jeff. Sorry, Councillor Tim, I overlooked you. No, you're... Yep.
Chair.
Then Councillor Carroll and Councillor Beck.
Couple of questions. So the environmental overlay, that's only about 5 square metres in the corner there, right? So right up in the top of Mackenzie Street, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know, I just found it interesting from that map that the part that is actually environmental overlay is the rest of suburbia of Middle Ridge. So it obviously didn't matter with the last guy that even though it was environmental overlay, that's figure 2. But look, I'll have another stab at these street trees along Rowbotham there. So you can see it from the map there. You can't even see the road due to these rather mature gum trees. And fair to poor condition, fair enough. But there's a few inconsistencies in the report. One of them said concerns about fauna have been raised. And you guys said, look, we didn't, it's not in the state government's koala mapping. That's because none of Toowoomba is, really. So I don't really think that not in the state government koala mapping is a valid reason, but we know that our mature trees are 40 years before we get any canopy out of them, and that would be, fair condition aside, that would be most of them. And so we've got the cut and fill along Rowbotham that you said is going to probably destroy some of them, and then we've got the driveways in the road that might remove a few too, and then some are dead. But there's still a fair few of them that are worth keeping, and I note the condition report on page 15 of board books, where the impact on street trees and the cut and fill and the removal of healthy trees for driveways. And then you've put conditions of approval have been recommended to ensure that the existing trees are protected for the proposed development. And then there's a similar thing in where it talks about the fauna. So I was wondering if you could just talk to me about, I need a bit more specifics. Some are saying it's going, some are saying it's staying. some are saying it's dead, some are saying we give, around those trees and what actual recommendations we've put in place to retain the majority of those trees. I would propose that if I was going to buy that block, it'd be more commercially viable if there was a whole bunch of big trees still at the front. But could I have an answer on that, please?
Councillor, through the chair. So the trees that have been identified for removal, the street trees identified for removal, are to allow for the vehicle crossovers. They have been supported by an arborist report which identified the trees for removal as being fair to poor health. Condition 49, which has been recommended if this does proceed toward approval, requires that all the street trees affected by the works within their precautionary area, all street trees affected by works within the precautionary area must be protected for the duration of the construction and must be carried out in accordance with that arborist report. So only the trees identified as those fair to poor health are those to be removed.
Okay,
as
that's
identified
great.
in
So
that report.
thanks for that, Emily. I appreciate it. So if you're going to put a driveway in from Robotham, it will be where there was an otherwise dead tree now that will be the driveway eventually.
As identified in that arborist
so
report,
much.
yes.
I appreciate it. That's all. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Tim. Councillor Carroll?
Thank you, Mr Chair. I have a few concerns. Rural res, 4,000. Why are the smaller blocks being accepted? I know they're able to be sewered, as mentioned before, but it is rural res designated. So I would have thought that, you know, people who live in an area, when they're designated an area, have comfort over the fact that they would be thinking that any other blocks that would be there would be 4,000 square metres or over. So I think that, you know, that's an anomaly, I think. The other thing, I also have an issue with the point of discharge, and we talk about having gabions and other things there, but all of that works really well unless there's high velocity of water, which there probably will be there. So if it goes under a gabion, it'll branch out and scour out somewhere else. So the stormwater and the point of discharge is of concern to me. The retaining walls, now I hear where we've gone under a metre, which means there's no control over them. So my concern, if it was over a metre, there would be. They have to be registered, they have to be supervised by an RPEQ. Under a metre, you don't have to do that. So my concern about that is that who then bears the responsibility for the maintenance and or upgrade of those should they be damaged? And, you know, I've been sitting around this table since 2008. We've had 2011 events, and then we've had since last year, and I wouldn't like to tell you the number of complaints I've had of inter-allotment drainage where they've had some sort of a Mickey Mouse retaining wall there because nobody has the responsibility for it, and the landowner doesn't maintain it. And, you know, I mean, I think... I think by having it under a metre, I think it takes itself out of any sort of control and or integrity. So that is a concern of mine. The other thing, I'd have to concur with Councillor Tim, the state government's mapping is absolutely inadequate, as we all know, and koalas are present in that area. I actually know they are. So I'd also like to say that with the road, with budgets the way they are, I wouldn't like anyone to think along that road they're going to have a footpath inside 20 years. So, you know, I think there's a fault in our planning scheme if that's what we have written in there, because, you know, really, I just, it was bushland area, and the road it is probably, even though it's designated, it is inadequate at the moment with width and other things, and we're
So
just making a rod.
Councillor Taylor, I mean, we can...
Answer those questions, thank you.
Yeah,
But
well,
that has been answered, and it appears there's nowhere to go with it.
Okay, so there's one of the officers there's the issue about the gabion and... yes. Yep.
Two, the retaining walls, and they're a big issue.
Well, yes. Well, Councillor Jeff's asked questions about the retainers, so I'm not sure
Councillors, the current planning scheme specifically doesn't regulate retaining walls that are a metre or below on the basis that they are considered appropriate and generally structurally appropriate. In terms of responsibility for maintenance, they would be the responsibility of the landowners upon which those retaining walls sat. So it would not be a council responsibility, but would be the responsibility of those landowners. You raised a concern in relation also to lot size. I don't know whether you wanted us to address that again in terms of the fact that, yes, the land is zoned rural residential and the planning scheme does talk about a 4,000 square metre minimum lot size. However, in the circumstances of this particular site, in the context of the surrounds, it's considered that it is appropriate to have a transition, given this land is capable of being serviced, of lots that, you know, range around the 1,000 square metre mark in the proximity of Mackenzie Street through to larger lots of close to 2.5, and I think there's one of about 1,400 interfacing with those rural residential lots. They're not small lots, they're not consistent with a low density, which allows anything from about 500 square metres up. So the whole intent is to provide, I guess, additional lots in an area that is able to be appropriately serviced and which is considered to provide a suitable and appropriate transition between the low density and the rural res zoned land. And I'll leave it to Michael to address the engineering issues.
Councillor, through you, Mr. Chair. With regards to the gabing structure and the concern for the erosion, so the intent would be the gabing structure would be constructed immediately below the inverter pipe, and the length, widths, those kind of components would be done through detailed design. So the idea of the gabing structure is all rock scour, depending on what the design evolved to, would pull the velocities out of the stormwater discharge to the point where there are slow flowing sheet flow, which would not cause erosion. That would be the plan through the opworks to achieve that outcome. For retaining walls as well, under the Planning Act there is an allowance for reconfiguring of lots to require retaining walls to come in for an operational works. So as part of this opworks, we would envision the retaining walls be assessed. So through that process, we will go down the path of investigating the integrity of the wall for structurally, and we would also investigate the type of material the retaining wall is out of to try and achieve an outcome that is, I guess, it's a long-term outcome that won't result in failure in the short term.
Thanks.
On that as well, sorry, there is some limitations in what our planning scheme does allow us to control, but we do have some mechanisms to try and achieve a reasonable structure and outcome.
Thanks, Michael. So councillors, it might be just depending on the feel around the table, that might be something to keep in mind when we come to voting on this matter, whether there's an appetite to include some of that. So just keep that in mind. So Councillor Rebecca, you next, and then Councillor Carey. Oh, you want to go?
You go first.
Councillor Carey?
No, well, thanks, Chair. Just a quick one. I noticed that there is a house there that is on the subject land built around about 1880, which very few of them left in Toowoomba. I'm just wondering why it hasn't been heritage listed either by the council or the state, what the criteria might be there.
To be honest, Councillor, I don't know why it hasn't been listed. So as it stands, that house can be demolished at any time, and there is no protection either at the local government or state government level. I can't answer whether there ever has been consideration during, review of heritage inventory or character inventory as to whether this particular dwelling has any particular significance, but you'd anticipate that on the basis that it hasn't been listed at the local level, that it just hasn't been recognised as being significant.
I think from the design of the subdivision it's going to go.
Yeah, right. Councillor Carey. Councillor Rebecca.
Thanks, Chair. I'm back on water. The first question is about bores and aquifers. So there is an existing bore on the site, and page 18 of board books talks about bores not being used for many years. It does show, however, that these aquifers are sitting right under the property, and it was one of the concerns that was raised by in one of the submissions, and the council officer's response was that groundwater is regulated by the state government, with council having no direct authority. And then that, but that the bore hasn't been used for many years, and that the subject site will use council's reticulated water supply. But my attention was really drawn to the very last sentence in that paragraph on page 18, where it basically says, furthermore, should this development go ahead, yes, there will be an increase in the impervious areas in the development, but it's unlikely that the proposed lots will cover 100% of the site, and it's not like there's going to be 100% of impervious cover on that site. And then it says, in this regard, quote, areas of soft landscaping will remain which may assist with groundwater recharge, end quote. Now, the first question is, has Water and Waste been consulted in regard to that? Because I know that at the height of the drought, council's bores in Middle Ridge were heavily depended upon by council to supply drinking water to residents.
So through, councillor, through you, Mr. Chair, so through the assessment process, discussions were held with Water and Sewer as probably a holistic approach for the development. I'm not sure whether specific conversations were held regarding the bore water. I will say the site itself, Water and Sewer had no issues regarding supply of water because it's located within their water catchment area. But unfortunately, I can't tell you whether there was specific discussions around the bore and whether we needed it through droughts or not, sorry.
Because I know that this chamber, we had a lot of conversations before it started to rain, where we were looking at what all of the aquifer levels were doing, and you know, there was a heavy focus on those Middle Ridge ones, and we were trying to work out what's the water quality in those bores, and it needs to be blended to such an extent, and how do we redirect it, and all of this sort of stuff, because they were so heavily depended on. So I think that us saying that the aquifers, the landscaping may assist with groundwater recharge, I'd hate for council to come to regret not really giving a lot of consideration to that. The second issue, and thanks very much for that, Michael, the second issue that I wanted to also raise, yes, the peak flow rates down Rowbotham Street. So back onto those conditions, and I listened with interest with what you were saying before, Michael, about the redirection, and I said what I had to say about that. But in terms of, because we just know the slope of that land, in terms of an increase in those peak flow rates to Rowbotham Street, now that the detention basin's been taken out, can you talk to us councillors a little bit about that, please?
Councillor, through you, Mr. Chair. So the design intent is the stormwater infrastructure will cater up to a 1 in 20 year storm event. So with that, any roof water will be discharged into the underground stormwater infrastructure. So the design that was provided by Keogh Myers utilises for pre and post development. So pre-development just assumes all site runs off with what little impervious areas plus the impervious areas that runs off to Rowbotham Street. So what Keogh Myers design relies on is any impervious roof area gets discharged into the stormwater infrastructure and then goes down through to Nidri Drive, and then any groundwater will still sheet flow to Rowbotham Street. So through Keogh's investigation, their stormwater management report identified that pre and post development flows, there will be a slight reduction in post development flows from sheet flows because of the roof water going to underground infrastructure.
You're right.
And now, thank you.
Apologies.
So do you have another question, councillor Rebecca?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Okay. Just if there's no other questions, councillor Nancy, sorry.
That's okay, thank you. So going back to those 1 metre retaining walls, I'd love to have seen a diagram of what that was going to look like, because I'm not great at imagination. I'm just wondering, are it's going to go along behind the tree line, isn't it, on Rowbotham Street?
Councillor through Mr Chair, so the intent for the retaining walls is we won't envision any actual retaining walls along the frontage of Rowbotham Street. So the idea would be we'd have a 1 and 4, the intent would be to try and achieve a 1 and 4 batter along the frontage of Rowbotham Street where there was earthworks.
Oh, so there won't be along there?
Not the Rowbotham
No,
frontage.
that's good. I was just concerned about the impact of the trees if that retaining wall was close to the trees. That was all.
For clarity too, through the REL and the op works process, there isn't an intent for retaining walls there. If a subsequent landowner decided to construct a retaining wall, that's something that would be out of our control at the time.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So then that funny little triangle on the end there that was originally going to be a detention basin, which I really still don't know why that's been taken away. I don't know whether a reason's been given for that, but with that gone, who is going to be responsible for that little triangle, or will that be part of that last block?
That'll remain as part of that last block.
Okay.
In regards to the detention basin as well, to try and help clarify that, so the initial proposal had the detention basin. Through discussions with our drainage planning team, the basin size for the versus the lots it was servicing, it was decided that from an economical point of view, it wasn't really an ideal circumstance for council being maintaining that basin for that many lots. And there was also concerns raised over having an open basin in that location, sort of out of sight, out of mind, about the maintenance of it and actually the visual impacts that would have on the adjoining landowners as well.
I would have thought a nicely set up detention basin. We've got some beautiful ones in our city now. I would have thought that would have been quite appealing rather than more concrete. But anyway, this is where we've landed, and I'm not sure that it's for the better, to be honest. I rather like the idea of the detention basin. I think there was even a selection of trees for what we're going to, and plants that were going to go in it, in the plans that were put before us. So the other thing in relation to the stormwater is, my understanding is that once council agrees to an approval, any stormwater issues that occur once that development is done, and if there's any impacts to a neighbour, that becomes a civil matter. So council has to be really careful in making sure that we've got this stormwater right. Because if we don't get it right now, we're going to be impacting neighbours, and we'll be able to say, that's a civil matter, it's got nothing to do with us. And so I really think it's important that we do get this right, because there are neighbours there who could quite easily be impacted if we haven't got it right, and they're the ones that have got to live with it. They're the ones that are going to have to go through court, a civil court, to deal with it, because we haven't got it right in the first place. So, or we've got it right and the developer hasn't done it right, I guess, is the other option that could occur. But that's why it's so important. That's why we're asking the questions. It's so very, very important that we actually get it right. So I just want you to reassure me. Thank you.
So I guess, yeah, through this process, through an REL, we get a high-level conceptual design done through the design engineers. Through that design, they bring it to us. The intent is they bring it to a standard that they can demonstrate that it can be conditioned, and through a detailed design, the concerns can be resolved. So as part of the condition set, there is conditions in there about no actionable nuisance to adjoining landowners. So through the operational works process, where we go through the detailed design to ensure that no impacts are seen for the neighbours at that time. That'll be through overland flow management. That'll be through stormwater runoff from internally to the development as well.
So just before I go to councillor Paul, Michael, are we to understand that, and that's why I raised, that councillors might want to keep this in mind when we get to the other end here, it can be conditioned as part of operational works even though the retainers are under a metre? Yep. Okay, so just keep that in mind if you want to make any changes to recommendations at the other end. Councillor Paul?
Mr Chair, I've just heard a fair bit about the detention basin, and it's disappointing to me that it's been removed. I think it, you know, it would serve a number of purposes, and it would be, as Councillor Summerfield has just said, some of our detention basins are magical. I'm just wondering if you'd give me an explanation on why it was removed and what the advantages of removing it are, because I'd have to suggest at this point in time, without a good explanation, I don't agree with it.
Mr Mayor, through you, Mr Chair. So through the assessment process, the discussions were held with the drainage planning team who raised concerns. There's two fundamental concerns. The first one was the cost for maintaining a basin floor versus the amount of lots it services. And the second concern we had was the detention basin was then just discharging straight into the Robotham Street Road Reserve. But in that process, the stormwater from the actual basin would create an action where it could create actionable nuisance to the adjoining landowners. The peak flows would be reduced, yes, but the basin would result in, say, stormwater runoff occurring for 4 hours for the adjoining landowners. That would be it'd be prolonged to hypothetically 10 hours in that scenario, because the detention basin will draw out the discharge time frame on it. And without any formalised table drain works and road works in that location, it did create an issue having that prolonged stormwater event discharging.
So I guess if I may, it was either option, because to do both was, you know, another layer of expense. You couldn't really have a discharge into Robotham and pipe it down to Niddrie. It was either pipe it to Niddrie.
Correct, yeah. So if they demonstrated that they had no increase in stormwater discharge from the site, it would potentially be deemed an unreasonable condition to be requiring stormwater infrastructure constructed to Niddrie Drive.
Yep. Yeah. So, Councillor James, you.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Chair. So just on that same point, I understand the point around explanation around obviously the maintenance of it and things like that, because I'm on the same train here about the detention basin. So from a planning perspective, do we consider the I guess the other side of that, so not necessarily the cost of the maintenance and all the other things with it, but more so the costs, as I think it was Councillor Summerfield raised before, like if there are worsening effects, the impacts of that actually, is that a consideration at all in that decision? Or is it more on like we said, a cost and an actual resourcing of maintaining the actual basin?
I think it's a combination of both. And what's the best outcome given a weighing up of all the factors that you have to consider as to the most appropriate outcome. At the end of the day, I guess the most significant issue is ensuring that the stormwater is appropriately managed and discharged. And I guess that's the primary consideration.
Yes. Mr. Chair, and I guess in saying to that point that was raised earlier, so let's just say whatever the condition that's put on this, if it happens to go forward, and then if there are worsening effects down the track, that becomes a civil matter. Not necessarily like it's not. That's the end of it from a council perspective. Is that right?
Generally, if there's inter-allotment drainage concerns, then they tend to be civil matters. As councillors are probably aware, and us as officers, often if there are drainage issues, they tend to also be referred to council and sometimes become a council issue as well, if it's a wider concern. So I guess technically it's probably a bit of both. There could be some civil considerations between neighbours, but also at times council, I guess, bears some responsibility if greater drainage issues are created in trying to reach a solution around those. But obviously, as the guys have indicated, there would be an operational works process, there would be detailed design, there would be detailed assessment of that solution in order to seek to ensure an outcome that's not going to result in inter-allotment issues or drainage concerns down the track.
You're right. Okay, so if there's no further questions, I had a couple, but I'll hold them till later on.
Can I just hang in there with one more, please, Councillor Bill?
Yep.
On that detention basin. So, if the detention basin was put in, what infrastructure would be required? Whether that be putting a gutter into Robotham Street and all that sort of thing, pipes, whatever. Maybe it is possible to have a solution with that detention basin.
Councillor, through you, Mr. Chair. There will be an engineering solution. Whether that would come down to be the developer's responsibility at that times for a reasonable relevant condition is where it would get a bit trickier. When the investigation was carried out, there could be additional table drains constructed, there could be large-scale works, but talking to drainage planning, the outcome of the stormwater infrastructure pipes was deemed the more appropriate solution at the time.
Okay, so my concern is if we don't do this that way this time now, in 2 years' time, at council's expense, we'll be doing something to remedy it. Is that a possibility?
If we don't do the actual stormwater pipes now, councillor, is that the question?
Yeah, if we don't put the detention basin in, put guttering in or whatever, or pipes, whatever's required along there to deliver the best outcome, is there a possibility that in 2, 3, 5 years' time that council will have to do it at ratepayers' expense?
If we were to provide the detention basin and don't do any other additional works, there is the potential that through complaints of residents or through concerns it could occur, yes.
No, I'm saying do the detention basin now and include all the necessary things that have to go with that, whether that be gutter and putting a gutter in there and any piping that is required as well. If that was all done now, there's no likelihood then of us having to rectify it in 5 years' time? Or are you quite convinced that the plan that's been put before us for removal of stormwater from the site in a safe manner that doesn't impact anyone, the plan that is before us is the best solution? The best solution, not
At a
solution.
conceptual level, yes, but it is subject to actually further investigations to ensure the numbers stack up, which would be handled through the operational works application.
Could someone elaborate on that for me, please? I'm sorry to persist with this, but I just feel it's too important with this one. Thanks.
Councillors, at the higher level approval stage, whether it's a material change of use or reconfiguring a lot, generally what you will get is a conceptual assessment to determine what's an appropriate solution, whether it's stormwater or any other issue, but particularly stormwater in this circumstance. The detailed design around the solution is then undertaken for the purposes of then seeking an operational works approval, which, as you know, is the approval for the subsequent engineering works. So at this stage, the detailed engineering design isn't undertaken, and that's the norm. It will be undertaken for the purposes of seeking the operational works approval. If, for example, at the conceptual stage, and Michael, correct me if I am wrong, if we come up with a conceptual outcome at this stage that we think will work, and then at the detailed design stage, for some reason, there is considered an issue with that solution or that an alternate solution may be more appropriate, then that can be determined through that detailed design and assessment stage, and there can be alterations made to the design at that stage. It's just the way that the process works, because it's just onerous to require the detailed design for the purpose of an RAL or an MCU that may subsequently have to be duplicated, during an operational works phase.
Thank you. I'm comfortable now. Thanks, Danielle.
Councillor Rebecca, then Councillor Carroll.
Thanks. Just on that, through you, Mr. Chair. So Danielle, though, those specifications in the op works do not come back to council for consideration. No. So we have to be confident and comfortable today with what we agree to. Yeah. Thanks.
Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question. And that has to be signed off by RPQ.
Okay. I think at this stage what I might ask is for one of the submitters, Toby, I understand, if you would like to come forward. Toby, sorry, I need to lean in. Look, either or, doesn't matter. Would you? Okay. It's just the way it's listed on my sheet here. So, John, you're welcome to present first. If you'd like to come across this side, John, and stand near the microphone. Okay.
Thank you. Ooh. I might stand back here so I can see what I'm talking to. Councillors, Mayor, guests, thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. Look, one of the things I want to do is I want to support an ecological sustainable outcome here. And just from the discussion that I hear, there's some good points to be made. I would argue that the report on the trees is actually what we see in a healthy ecosystem. There's some really healthy trees there. I've looked after that for about 20 odd years, and you can see a whole lot of juvenile trees coming up. Yes, there is the odd dead wattle, but that's about 12 years, and then the new wattles come on. And I'm seeing that on a regular basis. The majority of the dominant species is the New England blackbutt, and they are actually an endangered regional ecosystem elsewhere in this region, as I'll show you later. There's also emerging things like the Silky Oaks and the red elms, bunya pines, there's even lily pillies in there, pencil cedars, and also white cedars emerging, along with some smaller flora. In terms of the older trees, I think Tim's point of the hollows creating an environment for ecosystems was a really good one, because we see a whole lot of parrots there, and yes, we certainly have seen koalas in this precinct. One thing that I really want to encourage council to consider is the majority of the residents don't want to support a wider road within that region. We do want to retain those trees, and I've talked to everyone in that particular region. I think there's alternative road access that we could come up, particularly Flagstone Creek coming up through Spring Street, which is already widened for that purpose. Councillor Rebecca, your point on the catchment area, my background is a geologist. I've been a teacher for about 20 years, but I'm currently lecturing up at USQ in geology. That area certainly is a recharge area. The soils are very permeable. I can leave my hose there for about 24 hours and you'll see it all seep into the aquifers. So I think that's a really good point. And I think your point before about council implications are good to look at. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk today, my father was, he was the strategic planning engineer up until his death in about 2000. And he lamented, if you can turn the slide, he lamented after a 1987 meeting with councillors that he went to council and said, we've just built Crestbrook Dam, now we need to consider the next dam or the next water source. And the response was, we've just built a dam. So I really think the long-term sustainable development that you guys are looking at is to be really encouraged. He was also in charge of developing the flood mitigation throughout Toowoomba. Unfortunately, he was given a 1 in 10 year flood budget, he confided to me, which said the average councillor has a 3-year vision. So that was his comments at that particular time. And we saw the disastrous effects that happened in 2010. The Business Council wanted to build a wall, yet the engineers actually proposed for a whole series of dams so that the flood peak would be expanded instead of condensed, even though the duration of the flood might be longer. One of the things I do on a USQ tour is take them down to the Murray Quilt wetlands and show them some of that. But I also talk about the old deer farm that was there. In 1987, we had an event where we had 625 millimetres of rain in April. I saw trees on the escarpment slide 10 metres. Now, these are 20-metre trees, slid 10 metres and still retained. So the effects of water in our ecosystems is a really important one to consider in the long term. And one of the soil testers that was working on that development said to me that effectively some of the water tables there were about 1 metre from the surface. And when he told the developer that, the developer basically said, well, that's not my problem. So the long-term sustainable outcomes and development's really important. One of the things that I was really pleased that council prevented during that time was the Kearney Street natural depression there. Now, I suspect there's an olivine plug or something that chemically weathers, and that's why we've got a depression there. And there's a lake there. And that will continue to subside as we continue to see the chemical weathering taking place. Consequently, it's really good that that hasn't been allowed to develop, as the proposal at the time, 20 or 30 years ago, was to put a whole lot of soil in there, build it up and allow that development. Yeah, next slide, thanks. This is, actually just go back one. I just really wanted to highlight the difference between what we see in 1994 with regards to the development and moving forward to now 2019, that's the image I got of Google Earth, and you can see the development that's encroaching. And consequently the pressure that that's putting on Toowoomba. I know my father, going back to the dams, he basically wrote his master's thesis in 1973 saying by 2000 we'll need recycled water. Consequently we now have Wivenhoe connected to the Toowoomba system. Following one, this is more my background of expertise. If you can click over, I was a GIS geologist for quite some time and I had to look at endangered regional ecosystems. The imagery from that is 2005, but the purple outline that you can see there, that's the endangered regional ecosystem. And you can see where the development is, that red round circle, and that allotment that we've looked at. You can see where Nelson Park is, and also that proposed development that headed up to that northwest. Unfortunately, that got cleared in about, I can't remember the dates, but it was about 2012. Bottom of Nelson Park is similar to what we have on Rowbotham Street with the endangered regional ecosystems, the New England blackbutt. Then moving into the middle section, we actually see a whole lot of bunya pines emerging and a more dense forest with a lot of vine growth. And then up in that Nelson Park region, it was actually a whole lot of she oaks, and there was also one huge native fig tree that provided a whole lot of eco diversity in that region. Please move to the next one. Oops,
John,
back just one. Thanks.
John, you're about a minute and a bit, mate.
Thanks. Oh, and you can see in the top right where we see that development. Just in summary, here's some of my development concerns, I guess. I'm really keen to see these trees retained. And I'm hoping that we can retain those. You can see them in the top of the image there. Effectively, they are, even though it's not a gazetted endangered or regional ecosystem, it certainly contains that fauna and flora. We also see it from all of Toowoomba. Like I work up at Mount Lofty, Toowoomba State High School. I can see those trees from the other side of Toowoomba. We start clearing those escarpment trees, all of a sudden our garden city starts losing its garden city image. And so that's one of the things that I really think is important. I'm also keen not to see, and if you have a look at the reports, they want to clear right back to the fence line. I'm keen to keep that 8-metre buffer so that there's a building zone and you say, well, let's keep that retaining soil profile, because those laterite profile soils with some of the saprolite that's under them is really, it takes a really long time to develop and you're left with bull dust if you remove it. I would suggest a footpath potentially on the other side of the road rather than along the trees. The residents that I've talked to, apart from potentially one that wavered, they're all very supportive of that approach. Now talking to the developers, they're actually keen to retain the trees, which I'm encouraged about, including the ones on the development in places, particularly along that western boundary. So thank you so much for the time that you've given me to speak.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John before he goes?
Just talking about the clear to the fence line, I did notice that, and it was a question I wanted to ask. Is that in our road reserve to their fence line?
From what I'm understanding and my reading of it is it goes from the fence line back to where they build it. So if I could just get that, if I can grow the mouse.
What I'm thinking is that perhaps we're taking some land for future widening of that road, I don't know. And if that clearing is in what will become our road reserve, then I'm not sure that I could support that.
is there an officer that'd like to clarify that?
Thank you.
Could we go back to that previous plan as well, please? So, Kirsten, just the subdivisional plan. So, part of the current development, road widening wasn't conditioned for the hope of retaining those trees within the road reserve. The intent would be that 2.5 metres of land dedication that the developer's been required to hand over to council for the ultimate road reserve width. Any trees in that, we would envision that the trees remain prior to them handing the land over.
Thank you very much, Michael, because that's answered my question, because we have control of, once it's our road reserve, we have control of it, and so the trees would stay. Thank you.
No question. Yes.
Through
Councillor
you,
Jeff.
Chair. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks for your presentation. Really appreciate it. When you say 8 metres, you're talking about 8 metres from the tree base or from the road into?
If you look up at that, see that hatched horizontal lined area?
Yes.
There's a line from the road reserve. Yeah, road reserve. From that road. Then if I move it 8 metres back, to there,
right.
I would suggest that that land actually shouldn't be cleared as per the reports, engineering reports that I'm looking at the development, and that natural soil profile should be retained, because I've done some work on my grandmother's tennis court and I'm seeing eucalypt trees going in all the way 20 metres from that road reserve. And I think it's reasonable that you can expect, building sites understood if we need to clear that land, but within 8 metres of their fence line boundary, it would be good if the developers didn't touch that, but left it to the individual owners to consider how they're going to manage their land.
Councillor, through you, Mr. Chair. So the 2.5 metres was discussed previously, that trees in there will retain ours. And there is that 8 metre buffer between our dedication to the building envelope. The intent is there shouldn't be any construction in there. Thing to point out too, is through the conditions of the approval, there's very specific street tree protection requirements. That includes protection of any damage to the tree roots. So through the operational works process, any earthworks associated inside the development itself, development engineering in consultation with parks will review the impact of any earthworks on the trees, including their tree roots, and that will be done through professional arborists to investigate whether the trees will survive the earthworks or not.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Just clarification that the trees we're talking about are actually defined as street trees. Is that that's the same tree? We're talking about the same trees. I just want to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Now, well, John, it sounds to me as though you're having reasonable discussions with the developer, and they've got a similar desire to keep as many trees as possible. So that's. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, John. Oh, sorry, Councillor Tim.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your report. So the actual block, and council doesn't have much say over the trees on the block, but around the old homestead and the perimeter around Mackenzie Street there, do you have any knowledge of those species, and is there anything of significance in your opinion in there?
All the trees along the western boundary are all natives. There's one endangered species from northern New South Wales, I believe, that was planted. And they're about 5 metres high. So half of them are silky oak. You've got a bottle tree there. You've also got some flame trees. And also black beans. And they're doing remarkably well considering they were put in about 12 years ago.
Good on you. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So could I ask Toby to come forward, please? And same, Toby, about 5 minutes, mate, please.
Good afternoon, Mayor, councillors, council officers and other attendees. Thank you very much.
You might want to adjust that mic up, since how you're rather tall, sir.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One is the stormwater, and the other one is about just the nature of the development. with that transition going from the sort of urbanised.
I wonder if Toby could take a step down so he's closer to the microphone. Thank you. Sorry, I'm having, it might be my ears.
Yeah, that's okay. Is that better?
That's better.
Yep, okay. So talk about the stormwater is one concern. Another concern is just the transition from the urbanised lots on the western side of Mackenzie Street through to the rural residential areas. Okay, so the map I've got to showing here is just giving an outline of what I think, in my opinion, is the catchments that are going everywhere. And basically, just want to draw our attention to something that's called OLF1, and you can see that's a house. Our house is just to the north of that. Now, where that cursor is now, that's actually the grass tennis court. The proponent's saying that because the grass tennis court is still compacted and it contributes runoff as though it would be a house. It's a big area, I recognise that, but I take that on board, but it is a grass tennis court, but it actually has better blocks around the base of it. So it actually like a little detention basin, because there's a couple of little pipes on the northern side, and what happens is the runoff from that area actually goes through our property and then keeps going to where that blue arrow is just below it says Pernawilla Court, and that goes through the neighbour's property. So it's actually disappearing out into a different catchment completely. The catchment draining to where it says Robotham Street with the discharge point is basically A1, A2. There was a slight difference of opinion over those two boundaries to the south, OLF3 and OLF2. They actually drain somewhere else, but it's sort of all taken into account overall in the scheme of things. Maybe the next slide, please. So this just shows what the developer assessment has done. So the magenta is what they're assuming is going to be the catchment contributing to the various locations. So we can see the one that's in the sort of almost rectilinear one on the southeast side, that's what they assumed is the catchment discharging to Robotham Street. However, as I said, the catchment is actually smaller than that existing wise. So they're arguing there's no increase in peak flow rate with the development for two reasons. One is they think the tennis court already produces a significant amount of runoff, and secondly, it actually contributes to that point. But for those two reasons, as I said, that catchment is actually disappearing somewhere else. So they've actually overstated the existing runoff to that point. So it's not a valid comparison. So the runoff has to increase because of the lots fronting Robotham Street. It will increase the peak flow rates. And by my calculations, it's probably going to double the peak flow rate through that point. Just an aside on a comment that was made earlier about infill, if the lots get subdivided further along in the future, it just means you've got more urban air, more roofs, more runoff to happen off the roof. It actually increases peak flow rates further. And that's the problem with a lot of urban areas. If you start infilling, any flood mitigation works you have done in the past, this is an aside, sort of gets taken back because you've now increased the flow rate again. Okay, next one, please. Yes, this was just me just talking about how the runoff goes from where that little red splotch is, roughly where the tennis court is. It goes through our property, through Pernawilla Court, then goes into the golf course, goes through a little dam there, and then it just meanders through and goes down and ends up in East Creek. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the proposed development with the intra-lot drainage. Now, in my submission, I had a misunderstanding about what was proposed for those lots 6 through to 9 at the southern end facing Mackenzie Street. It's been subsequently clarified in more recent documentation that the land is actually, overland flow is going to Mackenzie Street, so it's just the roof drainage that's going through what is that green line you can see there, and it goes down to Robotham Street, and that's the one that goes to Needry Drive. But it's still actually more water than Needry Drive currently experiences. Okay, next one. Now, when we get to Needry Drive, these are just a couple of photos I took. So the one on the left is the actual outlet of the existing stormwater network in that area. And so you can see the black poly pipe, or the black pipe coming down. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see some old car tyres there. That was probably the first attempt to stabilise the creek in that area. And there's a whole stack of rock there that's been placed to try and minimise erosion. But the problem you have is you can see to the left-hand side, you can see the water is coming from other areas as well, and it's just slowly eroding away. It's undermining trees. So once you have an erosion problem, it's very hard to claw it back and improve it and restore it. And the thing about when you start putting in urban runoff in that area with the roofs, you have more runoff occurring more often. So like when you get a two-year rainfall event, for example, on a roof, it will actually produce runoff, and that will be discharging out through there. Whereas if it was on a natural surface, most of that probably gets soaked up. It's not really an issue here. And while the peak flow rate might, or while the velocities might be stabilised at just that outlet, ultimately it's all that extra volume that happens from all the small events that keep chugging down the gully. It just keeps nicking out a little bit more. The creek doesn't really get a chance to, like the vegetation doesn't really get a chance sometimes to re-establish itself and try to hold it together. It just keeps getting washed out by all these more frequent events and the extra runoff. So yeah, so one of the conditions was appropriate scour protection at the outlet. But you might put appropriate scour protection at the outlet, but that's not going to address resolving the actual current erosion issue, and it's just going to keep getting worse. And the one on the right there is just a bit further down. It's about halfway between this location and the bridle trail. And it's also got undermining trees. It's going around trees. Okay. And then lastly, this one more relates to just the nature of development and compatibility with the neighbourhood. So up the top right is a drawing that's in the submitter's application. So the brown is the rural residential, the sort of pinky colour is the urban. But you can see the rural residential is actually, totally encompassing the urban area. And so with the development, when we heard about it and talk about a smooth transition, we sort of expected as being rural residential properties on the western side of Robotham Street that, yeah, sure, you can put development in there, but it wouldn't necessarily come right up to our boundary. We thought it might still just be the natural terrain there. So, but now we've got some retaining walls going in, so a bit hard to see, but the sort of yellowy highlighted bits I've got there where they're being proposed. So it's just an encumbrance on us, which didn't really expect. We would have thought that if you're going to put a development in there, you could just transition it back to the natural surface. What this plan also shows is cut and fill, and basically every last square metre of this block has been changed, which is a bit strange to me. You think if you're going to transition from a urban to a rural residential, you'd probably leave something that's pretty much the same. And then finally, you can see there's 3 lots there, 10, 11 and 12, fronting Robotham Street, and the proponents arguing that the lot frontages are similar. And you can see on the southern side there, you can just make out the lots that front it. So in reality, it's probably really about 2.5 lots frontages that match what's on the other side of the road. And in the council report, it said the proposed lot layout of Robotham Street sides considered to be consistent with the existing streetscape and the density of housing within that locality. But I wouldn't argue that the streetscape frontage is representing the character of it. It's actually literally the density is the size, is the area. So all the other houses around it, there's bigger blocks and there's just more space, whereas these will just be urban blocks that'll just look a bit different. So that's basically my
Thanks.
summary. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby. Any questions? Councillor Jeff?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, through you. Thank you, Toby. Appreciate you presenting today. Just in regard to the increase in water and therefore the concern that you have, and given the mitigation measures that Michael has explained, as you would be aware of, councillors, it's mandatory to have rainwater tanks on any dwelling, has been since the 1st of September. So when that is in place, does that include, or the modelling that's been done that you've thought, does that include retention by way of, at a resident, of water through rainwater tanks?
I haven't actually considered that aspect of it, so.
Sorry. Yes, and of course, the rainwater tanks is a really good way of slowing that down, but however, given the amount of rain that we've been having, everyone's tanks are full, so that we always have to allow water tanks weren't there when we've had a lot of rain. So I just wondered if I could ask, if it's appropriate for me to ask, what your thoughts are on the detention basin that was part of the original.
Oh, well, the detention basin is a feasible option. I hadn't given it a whole lot of thought. I saw it. I did see it in the original submission that it was proposed, but then I saw it was taken away, so I haven't actually given it a great deal of thought.
Thank you.
I just wanted one other comment about just the guidelines for the planning scheme refer to something called the Queensland Urban Drainage Manual, and it talks about, in the stormwater objectives at the very front of it, basically talks about saying you don't increase peak flow rate. It also talks about the environmental aspect of it, and that you want to preserve and maintain it. You don't want to deteriorate it anyway. So basically what's going to happen to Rowbotham Street in the future, if it gets smaller, basically there's more water going to come off this area and arrive at Needry Drive, and you've got an erosion problem already, and it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse.
Thanks, Toby. I'd now call on Jess Garrett from Precinct Urban Planning. Jess, would you like to come up and present, please? And just because there was a couple of submitters, I'll permit you to have some more time.
Sure,
that's
thank you.
equitable.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Councillors, members of the gallery and council officers, thank you for the opportunity. I represent the applicant. At the outset, I would like to thank Council, I guess, for the fair and consistent assessment process. In the beginning of this development, we accessed Council's pre-lodgement process, where we sought pre-lodgement advice about the type of development and also the process. As we've discussed, it's rural residential. The applicant has proposed something that is potentially inconsistent with the planning scheme, and we wanted to discuss the potential planning merits and grounds that may support something like that that you see before you today. And consistent, despite the change in officers along that process, the outcome we have today is fairly consistent with the advice that we originally received, which is not always the case, but this has been a fair and good assessment process. Thank you. I just mainly wanted to respond to some of the key issues. Like when the developer, I actually worked with the Cluetts, who were the previous owners of this land, and provided them with advice, and then I started working with the current owner. And so then the main issues of everyone involved was stormwater, trees. As we've discussed, the native vegetation on Rowbotham Street, it's not protected. It's not protected by the council's planning scheme. It's not protected by the state planning policy, but it is of significant value to the community and also the native wildlife of the area. So it was always the intent to retain it as much as possible. So with that in mind, we started with the arborist and the engineer, because when you need to provide driveways, you need to provide site distance to those driveways. With regards to those two driveways on Rowbotham Street, I note that if this land was subdivided consistent with the rural residential zone, being, say, 4 lots, so 2 lots fronting Rowbotham, 2 lots fronting Mackenzie, you would still have 2 driveways on Rowbotham Street. So that's what we sought to retain, and that's why we combined the driveways for lots 10 and 11. So basically we sought the advice of the arborist and said, okay, can you assess the vegetation, figure out what is very valuable, where the opportunities exist for potential driveways. So in the end, we've got 8 trees that is being removed as a combination of dead or unhealthy trees, and also those that are required for provision of sight lines for those driveways. So 8 trees, I'd prefer that there be no trees, but I think that 8 trees is not a bad outcome. Also, with regards to those hatched areas that you can see, there was just a bit of confusion on 10, 11 and 12. They are actually, that represents the serviceable area in those lots. Council, as part of the information request, had a concern that those lots fronting Robotham Street couldn't be serviced by water and sewer. So through the work done by Keogh Myers, we were able to figure out that essentially is the building area that can be serviced for sheds, dwellings, pools, that sort of thing that need to go to sewer. So there is no intent to clear the balance area, but as it was noted, the vegetation within the site is not necessarily protected. The filling on Robotham Street will only be to facilitate those driveways. There's no intent to provide retaining walls or filling up to that those building pad areas. With regards to the footpath, the provision of footpaths along council's roads is a supportable outcome, and there should be a footpath on every street, in my opinion. But in this instance, and I concur with John, people walk along that eastern side of Robotham Street. No problem providing the road dedication to allow future widening if required, but providing a footpath behind those trees, one it presents septet issues, which is community safety, that you provide a footpath, it's all underneath the trees, you can't, the visibility is a concern, and also that there are no connecting footpaths on that side of the street. There are footpaths up near the golf club that council conditioned as part of that development, but there are no footpaths anywhere on this side of, or the western side of Robotham Street for a footpath to be connected to. So we've provided the land dedication as part of council's conditions, and in the future as part of council's trunk works, a footpath, it'll be up to council where that goes. I also have Nick Conn here from Keogh Myers if anyone needed additional clarification with regards to that stormwater strategy. The change from the detention basin, we originally proposed it where lot 12 was, and it was actually in response to council's suggestion that we investigated the stormwater pipe down Nedry Drive to the existing easement through number 18. So we investigated, that was one option. The other option was essentially another stormwater easement directly across Robotham Street through the private properties that would connect directly into Glen Lomond Park. We investigated that, but due to being able to purchase land and also the topography of Glen Lomond Park directly to the east of the site there, down Nedry Drive was considered to be the better option. And I note, yeah, as Toby indicated, there's existing scour, there's existing erosion issues in Glen Lomond Park, and I imagine if we put additional stormwater and necessitate some upgrade works, those erosion and scour issues will be addressed. And finally, the DA process, it's a matter of providing proof of concept, that we do the feasibility, we do some detailed design, but at the later date, council then can have a detailed look at the operational works for the bulk earthworks, the retaining walls, the driveways and the stormwater, and if there are any further issues in terms of what the detailed design throws up, council officers can assess that. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if there's engineering questions, Nick is available too.
Thanks, Jess. Councillors, any questions? No? Okay. Thank you, Jess. I'm not sure whether this one would be a question, might be a question. I just had in regards to the transition zone that the officers mentioned, was there any thought about remaining consistent with the rural res? And I mean, I understand there's a greater yield in this size subdivision, this lot size, but you know, listening to some of the potential stormwater impacts, the changing of the contouring of that lot through retainers, it would seem to me as a layperson that the normal thing would be to have the natural transition, that, you know, the north of bordering the smaller lots and across the road, Mackenzie is a natural buffer, and then you're into rural res.
Yeah. It is a good question. We did investigate, particularly for the Cluets, a 1 into 4 lot subdivision that was code accessible. That would have been a far, I guess, easier application. Honestly, it comes down to feasibility. That we had a pre-lodgement meeting with council regarding that, and the road reserve upgrades required, so the widening on Mackenzie Street, the land on Rowbotham Street, it was still required for a 1 into 4. And so in terms of feasibility, it just didn't stack up. The other consideration is that when you look at context, rural residential land, as Emily covered off on, is typically constrained by slope and or vegetation or environmental natural hazard constraints. This lot is fairly clear. Like there, yes, we've got some vegetation on Rowbotham Street, but in terms of, it's not constrained by council's overlays, it's not constrained by state government overlays, and the topography is fairly gentle. So it does lend itself to a more intense form of development. The developer has always been intended to provide these large lots. He never intended to go and chop it up into 500 square metre lots. With regards to the questions about further subdivision, the subject to council's future planning scheme that's being prepared at the moment, this land will remain in the rural residential zone. So if someone buys one of those lots that is 1,000 square metres and they want to go and put units on it or a dual occupancy on it, that's going to be impact accessible and it's going to be inconsistent with what the current scheme says. If council sees fit in the future, if this application is approved, this is developed, council may see fit to rezone it as part of the strategic planning process, but that's a matter for future.
So, can I get some clarity on that point? I would imagine that once this development happens, at a subsequent or at the appropriate time when we're working through the planning scheme and reviewing these areas, that it would probably be reclassified as low medium res as a result of this development, would it?
So at the current moment, it would stay as the rural residential.
Yeah.
With the planning scheme amendment, they're looking at land at the moment. Whether they choose to update the zoning of this land, that would be something that they're assessing currently. It will be fully serviced, but at the moment, it will stay rural res. So any future application that comes in while the current planning scheme is in, it would require assessment.
Is, you know, at maximum 2025. So from that point, or on the way, council may choose to rezone this as low medium density, consistent with the land to the north. It governed by lot size, of course.
Council, the adjoining land is, my understanding is it's low density residential.
Yeah.
So if council
yeah.
was considering a potential rezoning at some point in time, it would likely be to that zoning. However, they would need to consider that interface, I guess, as we're doing as part of this application, with that rural residential land. And I guess at this point in time, we're not able to comment on what the current intent is in relation to the potential 2025 planning scheme.
Just having sat through a few tidy ups, you usually redraw the line around when land has been subsequently developed and it's consistent with the neighbouring lot sizes, and it usually goes to that designation.
They may, but not necessarily. It will depend on whether, I guess, the intent would be to consider whether that land could be further subdivided, or whether they're happy with the level at which it's been subdivided. So it's not a given that it would be rezoning if this approval occurred.
Okay. So, councillors, thanks, Jess. Are there any more questions for Jess? No? Over to you. What are you comfortable to, Councillor Jeff?
Thanks, Chair. I just would like to revisit the retaining wall situation that Danielle mentioned earlier, that there was a little bit of a work through from the, noting that's at the operational work stage, and I fully get that, but it would be nice to know what thoughts there were and whether that should be something council could consider as a condition.
Councillors, we did have a couple of potential conditions in relation to the maximum height of retaining walls, and also in terms of the interface of potential lots to Rowbotham Street in terms of the battering of slopes not exceeding that 1 in 4. So we do have a couple of which we did send through to Kirsten. I don't know whether we can get those brought up. There they are. Oh, there they are there. So if council would like those included, then they're there and available to be included in any recommendation.
Just through you again, Councillor Carl, noting that Michael mentioned around, because it's an RAL, that there is some level of control. Does that need any further information on there to ensure that that continues, that you do have that control, or is that simply just saying that's the only control we need in regard to the 1 metre high?
Well, I guess it's setting an expectation around the maximum height of retaining walls and saying they are not to exceed 1 metres unless council for some reason determines that it's acceptable that they exceed that height. And then around that there would obviously be some structural assessment as part of detailed engineering design to satisfy council that that was appropriate. And then, as I think Michael alluded to, or Adam alluded to earlier, in relation to that battering of slopes to Rowbotham Street, to ensure that you didn't end up with potentially retaining walls along that street, but that it was a gradual battering of the slopes into those lots.
Okay, I guess I'm trying to pick up a little bit on Councillor Carroll's concerns as well, in regard to making sure that that we have some level of control over what the end product is in regard to. So I just wondered whether the 31A reads retaining walls must not exceed 1 metre in height unless otherwise agreed by council and meet a standard council agrees, or something to that matter. But Michael might be able to say, well, we don't need that, this is all we need.
Councillor, through you, Mr. Chair. So the intent is, out of context, that condition alone does seem insignificant and not adequate, I guess you could say. So there's additional conditions that require all works to come in for an operational works. And I believe on this one, the retaining walls are also called up to come in for an operational works. So through that process, council's consideration will look at the type of the retaining wall, the materials it's used of. We would seek that there's an RPEQ certification based on those retaining wall designs. Is it at the front? It should be. So I'll refer to condition 8.2. So as part of it, it's prepare and submit applications to council and obtain an operational works permit for the following. And so it's bulk earthworks and retaining walls. And that's our trigger to bring the development back in, so we have full control over what we're receiving.
So we get it covered under that.
Thank you. That's what I just wanted to make sure that was the case. But and that in concert, this will assist.
Yeah. So that is intended as a secondary condition.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. I'm happy for that to go in if councillors are of the same mind.
Happy for that to be included, councillors?
So, Mr. Chair, I probably know the answer to this question, but through you, it's not necessary to stipulate authorised by or supervised by RPEQ. It's
No,
just
that's a
normal
given.
condition, isn't it? Thank you.
Okay, so we're satisfied, got enough information, councillors? So if so, can I have someone, we move come back into standing orders? Councillor Tim, Councillor Rebecca, those in favour? That's carried. Now I just need to make reference that Councillor Melissa has made a declaration. And Council said there was no problems with Councillor Melissa remaining in the room to be part of the vote. So, can I have someone, is there a mover and a seconder? Councillor Tim?
I think Kirsten's just, you're adding that into the resolution that we add those couple of items. That's
so Michael, is that wording in the schedules there, or do you want to ensure that the wording is, that it's included as part of the operational works. The RAL conditions, righto. You're on. So we've got a, well, Councillor Tim, I think's moved. Councillor Jeff, you're happy to second? Righto, we have a mover and a seconder. Is there any debate? Councillor Rebecca, you'd like to debate the matter? So, Councillor Tim, do you want to speak at this stage?
Chair, look, we have, all things considered, a development within the PIA that meets all the conditions. We've talked it through. I had my own concerns about some very prominent trees, and I'm happy with the conversation from both sides on how we can best protect them. At the end of the day, we have a gentle slope, majority large field development site on a good site for development, and with my own queries that I've raised coming in here being addressed and adequately addressed, I think there's ample decision in my mind that Council needs to support the officer's recommendation here. I think that there would need to be otherwise really good reason to refuse this, and I don't believe such reason exists, so happy to move it. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Councillor Rebecca, speak against the motion.
I do, thanks, Chair. So this parcel of land, I'm not against it being developed, actually. I can see that it is in an area that, as I said, I'm comfortable to see it get developed, but this particular proposal that's before us today raises enough concerns for me that I can't support it. Councillor Tim discussed the personal concerns he has about the trees, which he's comfortable with. I am less so with the trees, and also I don't subscribe entirely to the arguments that the proposal is appropriate for the transition, because the argument has been made that the street frontage is equivalent to other street frontages in the area. But of course that doesn't address the actual size of the blocks. The street frontages might be somewhat comparable, but there is a considerable difference between 4,000 square metre blocks and the smaller blocks that are proposed. Those are the minor concerns for me. My two biggest concerns are first of all about water and the aquifers. And to me, it's not reassurance enough to be told that the aquifers may recharge. I have only been in this role for one term, but during that one term, it's been long enough to see extreme drought followed by extreme flood. And in extreme drought, we remember very well how reliant we were on those bores in Middle Ridge. And we haven't, in this report, addressed how council feels about their aquifers potentially being impacted here. And as I said, I would hate for council to come to regret in future years that we didn't give adequate concern to considerations of how those aquifers will be recharged. It's also a really particular parcel of land because it is at the head of two catchments. And I'm surprised to hear that the state government made the case that it's only a little bit of water that's diverting between, it's only a little bit of water that's going down into the Brisbane River catchment instead of the Condamine Belong, so therefore we're comfortable because I would go so far to say that if you raise those kind of arguments in the Murray-Darling Basin, with the Murray-Darling Basin folks, they might not be so amenable to the it's only a little bit of water argument. The other real concern for me is stormwater. Now, I am convinced that the proposal has satisfied that there's a lawful point of discharge, but I'm not satisfied that we can confidently say that there's not going to be an increase in flow rates downstream, and I'm also not satisfied that we can be confident that there's not going to be an adverse effect on Glen Lomond Park where that discharge has been proposed. And Emily, in speaking with us, said, I imagine those erosion concerns would be addressed. And we as councillors, we have issues that come before us informally, formally, all sorts of confidential situations that come before us where we have to reckon with when things go wrong. And so therefore the argument that this will be addressed in the operational works phase, it doesn't give me enough confidence that we're all right here, because I would like to have been able to see more detail around those stormwater plans so that I didn't feel like we would be back in a situation in a few years' time from now and trying to fix an erosion problem in one of our parks. So as I said, I can actually see that this parcel of land would be suitable for development. This proposal that we're considering today, I think, has some failings and some shortcomings that make me unable to support it. And I would urge councillors to give real consideration, because once it passes us today, it's not coming back.
Thanks, Councillor Rebecca. Is there a speaker for the motion? Councillor Jeff.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And this has been a really good conversation, discussion, and development proposal, I have to say, and working through from the outset, Emily, explaining things very well, and Michael supporting and answering the questions to a point where I have some comfort, knowledge that our officers have done the best job possible with the information that they have at hand, noting that this does go through an operational works stage. But I also thank wholeheartedly John and Toby for bringing forward concerns of the residents there, because it was through John particularly that we explored further the buffer for the trees along Robotham Street, and I think that's a very important point. And I appreciate the fact that John also mentioned that, you know, working with the developer, there is a willingness and in fact a shared appreciation for the environment that there is there. Toby then obviously provided some solid insight through his professional background in regard to stormwater. We need to make a decision on the information that's available here today, and based on the information I've had and on balance, given that we've heard around risk mitigation measures for the stormwater discharge, and the fact that we started with a detention basin and then the applicant was asked to explore other options, and then we've landed on where we are, with Michael then stating when we get to the operational works phase, if the numbers don't stack up as well as they thought, then there would be, and it seems the applicant is also very willing to find the best solution. In regard to Glen Lomond, and the pictures up on the screen there, thank you to Toby for providing those, you can see that this discharge will add further to that erosion. There's no doubt it will do that. But very pleased to hear that the applicant is also very mindful that part of the operational works will be the mitigations there in that area, which had this development not happen, that erosion will continue to happen at the same, if not greater rate than what it is now. So it may actually be a better outcome by way of having this development and improving that that mitigation of the stormwater discharge. So, look, with those things in mind, certainly taking on board the comments of Councillor Vonhoff, I do have comfort in where we are because of the answers that we've been provided today, and noting that there is this shared appreciation by the seams of the development and all developer and also the submitters of the best outcome possible. So with that in mind, I'm happy to support the recommendation by way of seconding it.
Thanks, Councillor Jeff. Speaker against?
Actually, a question, if I may, because I'm just a little bit confused. And I'm just wondering if I missed something when I had to duck out of the room. There was a point that Councillor Vonhoff brought up about Glen Lomond Park, about the scourge and the erosion, and I thank you, Toby or John, brought that up. But then Councillor McDonald has just said that it's in program for works to be done. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly?
I think, Councillor Melissa, it will be addressed as part of the works required by the developer.
So the developer will be required
Right,
to
as
do works
part
in
of-
Glen Lomond Park
At the
to fix that
discharge point.
stormwater discharge.
I stand to be corrected, but that's the case.
Yes, the developer would need to undertake what works were necessary to ensure that the stormwater discharge from their site was appropriately discharged and did not cause any worsening downstream. So they would need to address that issue.
So the issue in Glen Lomond Park will be rectified by the developer.
They would need to ensure that there will be no worsening. There's a fine distinction, in my opinion, and I can be corrected by the engineers, between requiring them to fix issues created by other development and to ensure that their development does not create any worsening. So in addressing the stormwater issues, there may actually be an improvement by virtue of the works that are necessary to accommodate their development, but they're not. It would not be reasonable to expect that they should solve someone else's problem.
But how do we know if there's any worsening?
They're conditioned to ensure that there isn't, and that would be assessed through the detailed design and assessment of that design at an operational works application stage, which would be endorsed by an RPEQ.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now we go to a speaker against. Yep.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you. So there was mention before about scour deflection. Is that something that we should be looking at? It's probably not the right forum, but I'm going to do it while I'm here. Shouldn't that be something that we should be doing on all of our, because there was one that we went and saw in East Street that pretty scary, and whether that shouldn't be something that we as a council should be addressing anyway. Yeah. So how do we action that?
Sorry, Chair, to interrupt. If we're going to go into detailed conversations about this, I need to leave the room.
Not on East, no. Just on all of them. Just that we happen to see that one. On all of them, that on the escarpment.
I guess that fundamentally could be a question for our transport and drainage team members in terms of a more holistic approach. I guess from a planning and development perspective and a development assessment perspective, we look at those issues on a case-by-case basis.
So that would be like an environmental outcome, wouldn't it, really? So maybe that's something we need to take offline, but I think it's something that we should be looking at.
I think that'll come down to, as you've suggested, a request to ISG through the CEO that we bring a report to council around that if there's a willingness for that, but that's for another time. We're considering this application. So is there a speaker again?
Comment on that, Mr Chair,
Well,
because
we're-
it's a cumulative effect of the developments that are approved that causes this.
Well,
And
if you wish to speak
that's where we
against,
need to look. I actually do wish to speak against
Okay,
this,
well,
if I will.
yep.
And I think most of my points have been used up. But the fact is, I'm not. We do this. We say no worsening. The only way we police it is if there's a complaint, and then by then, obviously, it's off maintenance, and things have happened. And I mean, been sitting here long enough that I just know how these things finish. And I don't think it's ISG's, I think it's a whole of council consideration how we work against this thing. I mean, we just inherit things in our portfolio. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced about the discharge point, the no worsening. Glen Lomond Park, whilst we say that things have to be done there, they won't be done in our park. It'll be before it gets to the park. So, and the other point that I'm against this is I don't see any correlation with the difference in it isn't an interface. The interface with the rural residential goes straight into smaller lots, and it's not smaller, it's at least a quarter and under a quarter of the size. So there's no integration. If there had been, you know, a larger one and then going back to smaller ones as we got further away from it, I don't see that that's integrated at all. And it is a rural residential zoning, and I don't believe we've met it.
Okay, Speaker 4, Councillor Carey.
Thanks, Chair. Just briefly, as a rule, I always am concerned that we need good reasons to ignore our existing town plan. The land is substantially rural residential, hence a minimum of 4,000 square metres. What's proposed are, of course, substantially less. Notwithstanding that concern, I'm prepared to allow the application, firstly on the basis that the officers have recommended it and have given substantial reasons in support of their recommendation. Secondly, especially as there is provided a range of sizes of allotments, small lots alongside existing small ones, increasing in size in those adjacent to rural zoned land. It's described as a smooth transition within the streetscape between existing low-density residential zoning and rural residential in the surrounding area. And thirdly, I'm influenced by the demand for more land to be made available for housing blocks, particularly bearing in mind the current housing crisis experienced throughout Australia, including Toowoomba.
Thanks, Councillor Carey. A speaker against? If there's no one against, we'll move to the vote. Just a brief sum up from my points. I do have some concerns around the transitioning, and I asked the applicant's representative about viability, and I wonder whether it would stack up in today's economic climate with the increase in land values and being more amenable to a rural res type subdivision. But anyway, that'll be for the majority of council to decide how we go. So oh, sorry, Councillor Tim. Yeah, sorry, mate.
It's all right, Chair. I was enjoying what you were having to say. But no, look, I would like to sum up briefly. We have a parcel of land, the south side of Toowoomba, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the better undeveloped parcels that we have on that side of town. We have huge demand for land, and we're a growing city, and land there's not going to make any more of it, and so we need to make good use of what we have. But there have been some very valid concerns raised today. The three that stick out to me. One is the retaining walls. Well, we've conditioned some stuff into the motion, additional conditions to deal with that. I take note the discharge into Glen Lomond through Ninderry Court is substantial, but this has been conditioned through operational works that will have a no worsening effect on that drainage, and I'm satisfied that that's quite a standard approach here, and and a smart one to condition. I had some big concerns about the trees, and really I think this is an example where a developer and the community are working together, and I enjoyed the presentations by obviously two very learned individuals who have a tremendous local knowledge of the area, and I really enjoyed that. And it's good to see their concerns, I think, being met, and both parties working together for what is, for the good of the community, ecologically sustainable development, which means we allow the development, but we also promote the native ecology and the local ecology of that area. So, look, Chair, I'm happy that every concern that I have, and I think every concern around this table, has been adequately conditioned or met, and I think that this is a good development moving forward, and I wish it all the best. So I'm happy to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Tim. So we'll go to the vote. Those in favour of the motion? Those against? Motion's carried. Thank you, councillors. How are you travelling? Can we have a 5 minutes? Let's please adjourn. Can I have a mover to adjourn the meeting? Councillor James, Councillor Jeff, those in favour? Kate, can we strictly make it 5 minutes, please, because we've got applicants and submitters waiting in the gallery. 4:17, we'll be back. Councillor James, the timekeeper. Okay, councillors, we might make a start again, please. Yeah, Nicole won't be long. Okie doke. We'll start again. Could I have someone to suspend standing orders, please? Councillor Carroll, Councillor James, those in favour? In favour of suspending standing orders? Yep, that's carried. So this is for item 6, material change of use, development application for development permit for material change of use, impact, food and drink outlet and operational works code advising device pole sign located at 350 Bridge Street, Wilsonton. Are we actually going to do these separately? Yeah. Okay, just sounds a bit strange, but anyway. We don't have any conflicts of interest, but look, if something pops up, we know that we're better off speaking up and looking out for one another. So over to you, Jayden, the officer who will be presenting here.
Chair, I'll be first.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, councillors. The report before you considers a development application for a combined material change of use for food and drink outlet and operational work for a pylon sign at 350 Bridge Street, Wilsonton. The site is located in the low to medium density residential zone and within the urban residential precinct and comprises a single land parcel, 1550 square metres in area, and currently contains a dwelling house. The site is located opposite the Wilsonton Major Centre, which is within the Major Centre zone, and adjoins a food and drink outlet to the west, which is a Red Rooster franchise, a veterinary service to the east, and council-controlled open space to the south. An aerial overview of the site context and the surrounding land use zones is provided in attachments 3 and 4, which is up on screen now. If I could please get attachment 5 up, just showing plans of the proposed development. So the proposed food and drink outlets will offer takeaway, dine-in and a drive-through facility with queuing for up to 10 vehicles with a waiting bay for 1 vehicle adjacent to the southern and western boundaries. The main restaurant building will have a gross floor area of 198 square metres with an external dining area of 11 square metres. This building is single storey and has a height ranging from 4.3 metres to 6.5 metres. Access to the site is proposed via a new crossover to Bridge Street, which is a state-controlled road. This functions as an entry and exit with left-in and left-out manoeuvres only. There is a separate pedestrian entry from Bridge Street proposed, a total of 10 car parking spaces, and the use is proposed to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days per week. The proposed advertising device, which is a pole or pylon sign, is to be located adjacent to the Bridge Street frontage. This has an indicated height of 8 metres, a width of 3 metres, and a display surface area of 24 square metres. And this will be advertising the proposed use on the site. The proposed development, owing to the zoning of the land, is subject to impact assessment and has been assessed against all relevant assessment benchmarks within the scheme. It was referred to the state as a referral agency due to location on a state-controlled road, and a response was received with conditions on this. Being impact accessible, the application was publicly notified. No submissions were received during the notification period. The proposed development is considered to conflict with several assessment benchmarks within the planning scheme, and at a high level, the development is considered to represent out-of-centre commercial development within a residential zone. And there has been no clearly demonstrated community, economic or planning need to establish the development at this site. Of particular significance, the development conflicts with the purpose and overall outcomes sought for the low-medium density residential zone code, which for non-residential development provides only for a limited mix of small-scale and low-intensity non-residential uses that service the day-to-day needs of the immediate local residential community and do not undermine the viability of a nearby centre. The proposed development is not considered to function to service the day-to-day needs of the immediate local residential community and would serve to undermine the viability of the nearby Wilsonton Major Centre. Additionally, the proposed use is not considered to be a low-intensity non-residential use when considered within the context of a residential area. The proposed use is intended to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and is anticipated to generate 850 vehicle trips per day. In support of the application, the applicant submitted an economic need and impact analysis report prepared by Norling Consulting. The assumptions and findings presented within this ENIA report, together with the arguments presented by the applicant in the submitted planning report, do not assist in demonstrating compliance with the purpose of the low-medium density residential zone code or otherwise demonstrate an overriding community, economic or planning need to establish the development at this site. In particular, the assessment has been summarised as follows. The development would not service the day-to-day needs of the immediate local residential community. The individual development would serve to further undermine the viability and primacy of the Wilsonton Major Centre. Locating the proposed development outside of the Wilsonton Major Centre is a commercial decision, and no sound planning basis has been demonstrated as to why suitable alternative sites within the Wilsonton Major Centre could not support the proposed development. It's considered that there are alternative sites within the major centre that could accommodate the proposed development. And the needs and benefits analysis in the ENI report does not identify site-specific criteria that justify locating the proposed development outside of the major centre, and no material, economic or planning need has been demonstrated for the proposed development. Relevant matters were also considered in our assessment, as the Planning Act allows a broad discretion to decide impact assessable development applications. On this basis, a balancing exercise must be undertaken based on the assessment of the development application against the assessment benchmarks, any relevant matters, and discretion must be exercised in a way that advances the purpose of the Planning Act. The applicant presented relevant matters within the submitted planning report, and these have been considered and are addressed within. However, on balance, the application is recommended refusal on the basis that it does not comply with the aforementioned assessment benchmarks, and the positive aspects and benefits of the development, including the relevant matters presented by the applicant, have not been found to outweigh inconsistencies with the planning scheme and adverse impacts. I'd also note that the advertising device component of the application is also recommended for refusal where the food and drink outlet component is refused, on the basis that the advertising device must only promote products or services available from the site on which it is located under the advertising devices code in the planning scheme. Thanks.
Thanks, Jayden. I note we don't have any submitters, but is there any questions for Jayden? Councillor Tim?
Chair, thanks. Got a few actually. And I'm going to just open it up straight away. So a month ago, and it was done in public, so I can talk about it. We had a major commercial shopping centre on the north side of town, and right next to that shopping centre, in a low to medium density rural zone, residential zone, that's right. A McDonald's came to town and the officers recommended it for approval because it keeps in line with the low to medium density residential zone code, which seeks to provide a range of mix of dwelling types and houses and community uses and small scale services. So your last one to us was that a McDonald's in Harlexton, right next to a commercial centre, on the basis of it, complies with the low to medium residential zone code. Now, cut copy Harlexton to Wilsonton, and we've got a major commercial centre literally across the road from it. We've got an unnamed commercial eatery in a low to medium density residential zone, and I would juxtaposing the two, propose that this one's better than Harlexton because this one doesn't have back neighbours, and there's a Kentucky Chook next door, Red Rooster. Sorry, one of. And the vet on the other side. So there's already a fast food right next to it that somehow, no school, somehow got a position in a.
That's one at a time,
I'll
councillor.
finish.
Yep.
The Red Rooster, sorry to call it the incorrect thing, got a position in the low to medium density residential site. Now you're saying this one doesn't comply with that because it's not needed for the to service the day-to-day needs of the immediate local residential community and undermine the viability. I didn't know, first of all, we were in competition about the viability of a major shopping centre. That wasn't even mentioned last month. And second of all, how is this any different to that? It looks like a Control-C, Control-V to me, to be honest.
Councillor, it is different in that in the circumstance of the McDonald's, there was no other suitably zoned land in the vicinity that could accommodate that development. That is not the case here. There is other suitably zoned land almost directly across the road that could suitably accommodate this type of development, and that is a big distinction between this and that other development. So we don't believe there's a planning need established for this particular development on this particular site. And this actually is a perfect example of a, I guess, consolidation of strip development, whereas it was not considered the McDonald's was. This contributes to strip development along that section of road. So there are distinguishing factors between the developments.
No, thanks, and that is a valid distinction that I didn't pick up on. I thank you for clarifying that. So when Red Rooster came and was put next door, did that come to this room?
Councillor Tim, I might chime in on that. That's, you know, respectfully ancient history, and we're working under a different planning system and scheme
I didn't know it was
and
so far
regime.
back.
Yeah.
I'll retract the question. Thanks, Chair. Appreciate that. But yeah, the competition thing, can I just have a comment on that? So there's a big thing in here about undermining the viability of a major shopping centre next door with, you know, competition and services and all that, but that wasn't even a consideration. So is that something we can take into account? How does that work?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. Sorry, could you just rephrase that question for me?
Yeah, I'll read the sentence here. The development would serve to further undermine the viability and primacy of the Wilsonton Major Centre. So that's the one across the road getting built. But we had this conversation a month ago where there was a major commercial centre literally next door, and undermining the viability and primacy of the centre wasn't a consideration that was even raised.
Councillor, again, it also feeds into the issue of the fact that we do have a major centre across the road, and we're not just talking about the physical Wilsonton shopping centre, but a centre that is zoned as a centre, and the fact that there is land in that centre that's suitably and appropriately zoned to accommodate that use, and that these uses should be accommodated primarily and first within that zoned land.
No, that's a very good answer and adequately addresses that concern of mine. Thanks very much.
Right, Councillor Tim. So Councillor Nancy will go to you next, and then Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. One thing that sticks out to me, and I've been in the room when previously we've challenged the economic need for something and we've been told, no, we're not allowed to do with that. That doesn't come into it, but sometimes it does. And I just would like to understand, get some sort of clarification about when a DA is entitled to take in economic need and when it's not.
Generally, if a development is proposed outside of an area that is preferred for that type of development, then we say, well, have you demonstrated that there's an economic need for this particular development, given that, you know, it is not a desired or preferred development in that particular zoned area? So things like this type of development, some councillors that were here will recall that it was a big issue on the North Point development because that was residential zoned land. And so, you know, it was clearly inconsistent with the zone. So they had to demonstrate why there was an economic imperative and need for that development on that site. Similarly to, for example, again, councillors that have been here long enough will recall the Coho Street development, which was again another predominantly fast food based development that's now been developed that was proposed again on residential zoned land. And on that basis we said, well, why here? Why is there an economic imperative for that to be located on this residential zoned land? If this was proposed within a commercial zoned area, then it would be a use that would be consistent, and on that basis you would say, well, it's something that we want in those zoned areas, it's something that we contemplate, and therefore, you know, we don't need an economic assessment.
Okay, thank you. So going back to Councillor Tim's, you know, vet on one side, a chicken place on the other side, three doors down another chicken place. It's a line. It basically backs onto the airport, or at least airport takeoff area, and that airport is getting busier, or it's not diminishing. Yeah, but that's the takeoff area. That's where they're still taking off. So the noise and whatever reminds me of the castle a bit, I have to say. You know, we all know how that went, and I just do believe that at some stage or another down the track, that whole line along there, and could be up to 10 years before it happens, but I don't believe houses will back onto that airport for too much longer into the future. And I do think that we need to take that into consideration, because people will reach a point where they'll say, well, enough's enough, I can't live here any longer because of the airport noise. You know, we've got firefighting planes lined up there for the season. They'll take off whenever they have to through the night to... So there's a lot of traffic that does actually occur there. Some of it's noisy because those firefighting ones are really noisy. So I think that has to be taken into consideration as well. It'd be different if it was more houses behind it, but it's not. It's actually a noisy industrial area right behind it. Excuse me. And you'll be pleased to note I haven't forgotten the Queen's Park issue, where we have shops all the way along Lindsay Street facing onto Queen's Park, which really should be beautiful homes looking over our beautiful park. It's all shops, and that's not all old planning scheme, because some of them have been done in quite recent times. So I think we have to give this really serious consideration, thinking about the future, thinking about what we've already agreed to within the CBD basically of our town, and then looking at what's out there either side of this now. I'm confused as to why it's being declined, to be honest. I don't understand. Thank you.
So I guess there's no question in that. Councillor Nancy expressing your...
Sorry, Councillor Bill. The question was, based on everything that I've said, I really don't understand. Can you advise why we are refusing it? Because I don't get it.
I guess we've already enunciated the basis of refusal is that there is appropriately zoned land within the centre almost directly across the road, which is not the case in a range of other developments. Plus, I could be wrong, but I would be pretty certain that the majority of those historical commercial uses pre-existed even the 2012 scheme, and despite that, Council of the day made the decision that that land should remain zoned residential. And also, you know, a very big issue and discussion around some of the other fast food developments was around the whole issue of strip development. Well, here's a perfect example of strip development. And I guess council has to make the decision whether they wish to contribute to additional strip development. If perhaps council is, you know, accedes to the fact that they're happy for all of that strip to go ultimately to commercial development, then so be it. That's a council decision.
Thanks, Danielle. Councillor James next, and then Councillor Carroll, and then Councillor Carey.
Yep, thanks, Chair. Two questions, please. I'll keep going on this theme that we're on the moment, just around viability of nearby centres, etc. So just what's the criteria for defining that? So is it size number? Do you know what I mean? Like, what criteria do we use to define to say that something is going to undermine or not undermine the viability of a nearby centre occurring within the zone?
Yeah, it's a slightly different issue to the issue of us saying that there is suitably zoned land on which this can occur. So that's one argument. In terms of viability, my view would be that this development in isolation would be unlikely to be said to undermine the viability of the Wilsonton Centre, because what would generally happen is you would have to say that a development would basically threaten the continued economic viability of the centre. I guess though, if you're looking at potentially cumulative effects of this type of development, we've got this application, we have a further application we're considering today in the vicinity, and you can bet that if these are approved, there'll be more. It's when, I guess, do you get to the stage where cumulatively you're encouraging the development that potentially could undermine the viability of that centre. And that's not, there's not a hard and fast test or criteria around that. It's really, you know, considering whether cumulatively, I guess, a range of these developments is going to undermine that, because, you know, I think it would be fair to say and honest to say that this development, standalone development, is not going to threaten the Wilsonton Centre in itself.
Yeah, okay. And then, Chair, if I can, the second question I had just on, it's at page 76, just around the proposed includes 10 car spaces, one which be provided for people with disabilities, one for staff, bikes, et cetera, et cetera. So, what, I'm forgetting the numbers that we had there, but one car park provided for staff parking, is that adequate? And like, I mean, so because obviously I would assume it's going to have more than one staff member.
The scheme doesn't distinguish between how the car parking provision is provided. It just requires a certain number of car parks. I guess that car park is probably being designated for staff parking because it's in an awkward location at the back of the development, but there's no reason why that can't be designated for that purpose, because there's no distinction that says staff can't park within the car parking provided for a development, and this development appears to comply with the car parking requirements under the scheme, so it's acceptable.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
We'll go to Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been around long enough that I understand about what happened at North Point, and it was approved by a DAP committee that wasn't made up of councillors, it was made up of planners. Councillors could actually make comment and ask questions, but we didn't have any approval rights, so that's how that worked at that time. That's before the council was set up. I'd just like to say that Wilsonton Centre has got a new owner, a new person who owns it, and they've been refreshing and expanding the centre. So I am aware they've got vacant sites, so it is a big centre. They've put a lot of money into it over the last 10 years. They've had two owners, and they've, really expanded. It's quite big. So,
Councillor Carroll, a question.
That not a question. Well, not really. I'm just saying that there are vacant sites there. So I do agree.
We need to wait for debate. If you've got a question, ask the officer.
Well, I think some questions have been cloaked as comments, so I won't say. I won't ask. I know it's strip development, and I know the other one was too. So. Okay,
so there may be an opportunity for debate. That's all. So, Councillor Kerry.
Yes, genuine question, I think. In the report, it lists on page 72 around about 12 reasons why it doesn't. The application doesn't comply with the assessment benchmarks from strategic framework element 3.3.1, bracket 11. I won't read them all down to number 12, which was transport access and parking code, etc. But a lot of them. I was just wondering, at the time, one assumes, well, two questions. One, was there a pre-lodgement meeting? And two, were these issues raised at that stage, and the applicant fairly pointed out that they had a hard row to hoe if they wanted to proceed with this.
To be honest, Councillor, I'm not sure whether there was a pre-lodgement held in relation to this, but I guess from an officer perspective, it has been clear in relation to this application that officers have had significant concerns as to the consistency and appropriateness of this development proposal, so that has been since the application was submitted.
You're right, Councillor Carey.
It doesn't matter, but one assumes that that could be ascertained whether there was or wasn't at a later time, but for the moment it's...
Yeah, and look, it's always the applicant's prerogative to actually, schedule a pre-lodgement meeting, yeah. Oh, look, for the time I've been involved in this portfolio, now for the second time, I always take the opportunity to advise applicants to have a pre-lodgement meeting.
I could be wrong, but I have a vague recollection this may have been the subject of a pre-lodgement, of which the advice was given that it would be difficult from an officer perspective to support this development. So it was pre-lodgement, and then from the time the application was submitted, there was a pre-lodgement meeting held on 11th February 2021, where that advice was provided, yes.
Councillor Melissa and Councillor Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the report. Can you please just expand for me the DTMR ruling on this?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. Sorry, I should just preface that unfortunately the officer that prepared the report is unable to attend today, so I'm presenting it on his behalf. I believe attachment 5 or 6 has attachment 6 has the state response.
Because it says it's been decided to approve the application subject to the following conditions. So if the applicant satisfies those conditions, does that then satisfy the transport access?
No,
I'm just trying to understand, so can you expand on that, please?
The state government referral, there are provisions against which state interests are assessed, and they are separate and distinct from the planning scheme and the provisions against which the local government assesses an application. So the development application comes in, there is a trigger because it's on a state-controlled road for it to be referred to the state for assessment, which we call through SARA, and then they assess it against their assessment provisions. And if they're happy that their state interests have been addressed, which is, I guess, safety and appropriateness and access to that state-controlled road, then they will confirm that they're happy on that basis. The consent and approval of the state in terms of their interests doesn't override any local government or officer assessment of the development application in terms of the assessment benchmarks against which the local government assesses the application. They're distinct.
May I have a follow-up? Thank you. So may I then try to understand if SARA is saying that it's decided to approve the application based on these conditions being met, what is it of our planning scheme that says no from a transport access perspective? Can you explain that, please?
We're not, I don't think,
go for it.
Councillor, through the chair, the performance outcome PO23 that's listed under our Transport Access and Parking Code relates to refuse collection from a waste collection vehicle, and the commentary provided within the report is that there's been insufficient information provided to demonstrate compliance. So that would be the volume of waste, the storage, and how that is collected by a vehicle on site.
Okay, so I've misunderstood. When I read the DTMR SARA and saw the transport access, I assumed it was, so it's actually, that last point there is about the refuse collection. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Councillor Tim.
Thanks, Chair. I've had some pretty difficult questions and you've done a really good job, so I appreciate that. I just wanted to pick up on this 8 metre high pole sign, which has to be part of their application, but again, most fast food restaurants have a pole sign, and I've never seen one as part of the application before. So is it standard to need to approve the sign? How come this one is?
Yes, there are, it is accessible development if it doesn't comply with the criteria under the Advertising Devices Code, and anything that's in the nature of a pylon sign will generally be accessible development, and in this case it is accessible.
So if there's no further questions at this, Councillor Jeff?
Just a quick one, if I could, Madam Chair, through you, just on page, give the page number for you, if I can. Page on Board Book 76, just talks about the Human Rights Act, Section 15, in assessing recognition and equality before the law, and Section 24, property rights. Not sure who I pose this question to, and I raise it because the next application has Human Rights Acts noted as sections 15, 21, 24, 25, 27 and 28. And I must admit, when we get our reports, it's rare that we would see too much of that in our reports. The previous one this afternoon had a couple in it as well, but I just wanted some explanation around that section 15 and section 24, if that's possible. Through you, Chair.
Sorry, it's been a while since I have looked at these provisions, but obviously, as councillors know, the Human Rights Act and human rights has become a very topical issue, and something that, would it be 12 or 18 months ago, there was a determination made that we needed to include a provision in our council reports, confirming whether we considered that, you know, a decision in relation to a proposal could impact or have an impost on human rights. In most instances, I don't think there's been one instance where it's been considered that a development proposal has had an impost on any human rights, but what the officers do when they're assessing an application is try to identify, and there's a whole number of sections and different criteria under which, you know, human rights might be impacted, and so the officers try to address those that may be impacted. So I guess we try to look at recognition and equality before the law in terms of, for example, you know, someone's lawfully made an application, has the right to have that assessed and determined lawfully, and if that's approved, to, you know, progress with their development. To be honest, in relation to property rights, I guess again that's probably a reflection of the fact that someone owns a property, has a right to apply to undertake development on that property, and therefore, you know, we're lawfully obliged to consider and assess that report and that assessment of that application. Oh. Thank you. Nicola has pulled up the section in relation to property rights, which is all persons have the right to own property alone or in association with others, and a person must not be arbitrarily deprived of the person's property.
Thank you. I raise it because I hadn't actually seen it before, and the next application, as I say, has 6 or 7 of them, and yet the similarities between this application and the next one seem greater than having an extra 5 human rights sections attached to it.
I think it's a reflection of the fact that 2 different officers assessed and have obviously just picked different criteria. Okay,
no, it's just, yeah, thanks. Yeah, rarely do you have that many that are attached, but thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, if there's no more questions at this stage, I'd like Andrew Hill from Alpha Planning on behalf of the applicant's consultant representative, to come forward and address the panel, please. Thanks, Andrew.
You got to keep it down.
When that's on,
yep.
You're on.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Andrew, you know the time, and you've been, yep.
Time, yeah, it's almost my bedtime actually. Yeah, and it was exactly a year ago that I was in here last year, and it's not joking, I do go to sleep very early. Danielle will know, I send her emails at 4 in the morning. Thank you very much, and excellent questions from all the councillors, and I'd like to try and answer them in my response, but if not, I'd like to hear from them again so that I can answer, because I really don't feel that they were adequately addressed, or that the report itself adequately addresses the issues for these applications. right from the start, it was apparent that it was the officer's intentions to just refuse this application without any further regard. There's issues within the recommendations that relate to matters that purportedly cannot be conditioned to be approved, that were not raised in an information request, even though we asked for one. We asked for an information request, didn't receive one. And Councillor Tim, you brought up a good point about a similar development that's been approved, but just back in October, there was a development approved right across the road on the western side there of the shopping centre on the corner of Richmond Drive and Bridge Street, that essentially we're looking at all the same issues arose as far as zoning, its proximity to the centre, surrounding uses, etc. This use, this proposed use, is either side has non-residential uses. The economic needs impact assessment has demonstrated that there is an economic need, that there is planning grounds for the approval of this, and that there are no adverse impacts upon the Wilsonton Shopping Centre. Now, in assessing that, council should be looking at the impact of that use itself, not a cumulative impact of what may else have been approved or what might be approved in the future, but just looking at this one, because obviously I got the economic needs an analyst to give me some feedback to this, is that if you look at the cumulative impact of this development plus the other one that will come up next and the one that was approved on the corner of Bridge Street and Richmond Drive, we're looking at 1.1% of the sales for fast food within the Wilsonton Shopping Centre, which is negligible, have no impact. And in fact, as Councillor Taylor brought up, there's new owners that are doing good things there. My clients have the car wash within that shopping centre there. They've discussed this application. The application was under public notification. The shopping centre has no issue with it, obviously, because no submissions were received at all. And I mean, I don't want to go over things again, but you look at the context of the site itself, non-residential uses either side, the airport behind, the main road, the shopping centre and non-residential and the centre zoning land across the way. And as I said, with the location itself, and don't forget that in between this application, the next application, the application that was approved up on the corner of Bridge Street and Richmond Drive, there's a total of 4 different economic needs consultants that have reviewed development directly impacting on the centre that's directly adjacent to it. And not one of them, not one of the 3 for the applications, or the peer reviewer has said that it's going to have an adverse impact on the shopping centre itself. In fact, if, and as I said, even with cumulative impacts, 1.1%. Referring back to the other application that was approved on the corner of Bridge Street and Richmond Drive, and this is a little disconcerting for me, is that they provided the same justification that we have for approval. And admittedly, every application is judged on its merits. What it can be approved on one site doesn't necessarily have to be approved on another. However, locationally, essentially exactly the same, except our development will not direct traffic into residential areas. And that's the biggest difference. Everything else within the one that was just recently approved, the community benefit, the economic need, the impact on the zone, and the fact that as the applicants for this other one that's been approved said, the remainder of the major centre zone is either committed development or within the area of the Wilsonton structure plan that is intended for mixed-use development or residential development up to 3 stories. And further, locating a drive-through food outlet in these streets will encourage non-residential. If all 3 of these, or even 1 or 2, were to be put down in, say, Erin Street, where it's purported to be, we're talking about thousands, not hundreds, thousands of additional traffic movements going through residential areas because of that location. Whereas keeping it within the area that's proposed keeps the traffic moving along the main road. Main roads have said there's not going to be any adverse impact. In fact, it's just a drop in the bucket for what's going to be, for the existing traffic there. So it really is concerning. And having said that, I'll just read a little quote that I have from the report for the one that was approved, which, as I said, ours have exactly the same grounds for approval. Ours have exactly the same grounds for approval, but better location because of the lack of potential traffic impacts on residential areas. This is what was written for the approval in October for the other site. As the proposal does not comply with the low to medium density residential zone, the proposal was considered against relevant outcomes in the strategic framework. An assessment against the strategic framework concluded that the proposal can comply with the strategic framework subject to reasonable and relevant conditions. And as I said, other matters that are raised within the report regarding acoustics, at the pre-lodgement we were told we didn't even need an acoustic report because both sides were non-residential, that if we just put up acoustic fencing it'd be fine. Now it's being raised as an issue for refusal. Anyway, it goes on to say, in particular, the proposed development will service a local need. How's not, will contribute to new employment opportunities in the catchment, and the design of the development is considerate of surrounding residential built form. Well, our built form hasn't even been raised as an issue. So when you have the existing centre cannot accommodate this development, the rest of that area is not intended as part of the planning scheme. It's intended for mixed use, and of course you can't have a drive-through fast food restaurant on the ground floor and mixed-use residential development above it, and it negates the issues with traffic. So to me, thank you. To me, I'm quite perplexed as to why this is being recommended for refusal when the one on the corner of Bridge Street and Richmond Drive was recommended for approval. Having regard for the fact that the assessment of that had to take account of the same issues. So yes, so as I said, and as far as retaining those sites as residential development, well, if you look at the aerial photograph, if that's not too much trouble, if it's okay to bring that up. Looking at from our site, we have a commercial use on the other side. Directly opposite is commercial zone land. To the west is commercial, and I think strip development's been used as a bit of a dirty word here, but that's exactly where you want these types of uses. And in fact, that is major centre zone land across the road, the Wilsonton Shopping Centre. If you look at the two other major centre zoned lands within Toowoomba, it's Clifford Gardens and Carney Springs, and both of them have land across the road that's in the low to medium density residential zone, urban consolidation precinct, which is what this isn't, it's a defining difference, where these uses are intended. And the only logic that I can come up with, and I have discussed this with the planners, but I couldn't get any feedback, the only logic that I can see why it's not is because the urban consolidation precinct also requires residential densities at a high density, which can only be achieved by multi-level development. Now, obviously with the airport there, that can't be achieved. You can't go over single story, otherwise you're running into trouble with the airport. So I think the planning scheme is flawed as well in that respect, and kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that instead of saying, okay, this is where we could have like development where we do in others, you've got the McDonald's and the Chinese restaurant, etc., across the road from, and the drive-through coffee shop, etc., across the road from Clifford Gardens. And then in Carney Springs, you've got all those restaurants and car washes and Pizza Hut and what have you down that way as well. So to me, I just cannot see, even without the comparison to the reasons for approval for the one on the corner of Bridge Street and Richmond Drive, why this can't be approved in itself. It talks about car parking having detrimental impacts on adjoining uses, but both adjoining uses are non-residential. It talks about acoustic impacts, and as you can imagine out there, it's not quite regardless of 24A. In fact, if there was now a need, even though in pre-lodgement meeting we're told there wasn't a need for an acoustic report, I'm sure we could provide that, and the approval could be conditioned that the hours of operation be linked to that. So if the acoustic report said that the hours of operation are limited to 7 a.m. to 10 p.m, so be it. But I think based on the fact that the environmental officer at the time told us not, and in fact there's an inconsistency in the report where it has comments from the environmental health officer that said that they have no environmental health issues, that there's no issues, yet it's listed as a reason for refusal. Odour, there's only one development I could find in Toowoomba where odour was ever raised as a potential issue. That was a Hungry Jack's back in 2012, and again could easily be conditioned for an odour report. Okay, thank
Have to
you. And the
wind
same for lighting. But I think I've covered off on everything that I need to now, and if anybody has any questions, hopefully not too many because my mouth's drying out now, but I'm happy to field them, including any from Councillor Tim, Jeff, Councillor Carroll, all those that asked questions previously.
So I've got Councillor Kerry's indicated he has a question.
Yeah, no, thanks, thanks Andrew for your comprehensive coverage. You might recall I asked a question about a pre-lodgement meeting. There was one, I take it, according to
was
your,
correct, yes.
and the difficulties that are now in the report were the subject of the advice given to you at the time that you would face difficulties.
It is correct. We were advised in the pre-lodgement meeting that due to the zone and precinct, that it was not considered to be a consistent use within the zone, that we would need to provide significant justification, that we'd have to justify the departure or perceived departure from the planning scheme in that application, such as through an economic needs report, demonstrating economic need, planning need, and that there would be no adverse impact on the centre. Now, we've done that, and in the same manner and the same way that the other one that was approved down the road was done. And in the pre-lodgement meeting, as I said, we were told we didn't even need an acoustic report or a lighting report. We weren't afforded the opportunity, even with an information request, as the other application was, to address those issues either. So there's just, right from the start, it's going to be refused. That's it. And can you imagine if my clients, after having seen that approval in October and the advice I'd given them,
So, yeah. So just before I want to chime in on it, before I forget, Andrew, there was Councillor Melissa raised the issue about the transport. That was clearly articulated by the officer that, traffic movement, entry, exit onto the main road is a separate issue, but the issue around garbage disposal didn't seem to be cleared up. I would like to hear from the officers from this, or did I misinterpret that, or was there sufficient information provided around garbage collection and entry-exit capability on the site?
Thank you, Chair. As I mentioned previously, I wasn't the assessing officer for this one, so I can only go off the information that I've got in front of me. The non-compliance identified with the Transport Access and Parking Code that was spoken to before is about refuse collection. It states that figure 19 within the planning report submitted by the applicant indicates waste collection by a rear lift refuse collection vehicle. But based on the site layout that's being put forward, it has not been demonstrated how that can be adequately achieved.
Okay, so then my question, I guess, to you, Andrew, is are you able to address that?
Look, I believe that we can. Again, there was no information request to enable us to address that during the process, but I have since spoken to the relevant other consultants, and we believe that yes, that we can. Mind you, we do have RPEQ certified. I hope they are. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain that they were RPEQ certified manoeuvring diagrams. But the site is not so constrained that we could not address that. No.
Okay, yeah, and look, just a small note. Officers will make a decision based on the information provided. They don't always have to request information, is my understanding. So I think there's a level of expectation that information is provided. It's at the officer's discretion always that whether they request information or not, to be fair.
Look,
I'm just trying to have a balanced
sure.
A position here, yeah?
Yeah, look, that's okay. And I guess my point was just that opportunity was afforded to the other one down the track, and I think that it would have been a little more productive to do it with this. We could have addressed that.
Okay. So, Councillor Mel, you had your hand up prior, and then Councillor Carroll.
No, that was my question.
Okay.
You've just fixed that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you,
Carroll.
Mr. Chair. I do have TMR's left in, left out. That's what it is. So there's no conflict there with that. But my question, Andrew, you just mentioned that odour shouldn't be an issue. Odour is an issue. And I don't see anywhere here where there's anything about it. I worked in a building in Gundawindi where a Red Rooster was just 2 doors up, but the kitchen was behind, came through the air conditioner all day. Yeah. The cooking smell made me sick. I haven't eaten it to this day. So it is important, and I think we talk about vets. It's only a vet next door. Yeah. My dogs go to a vet and it costs me more than me going to a doctor. So I care about my animals, and I think that, I think that air and amenity for a vet is very important, because there's people work there as well as looking after sick dogs and public that are in there. So I just want to know what the odour status here is, because it's not mentioned, because they do emit odours.
Yeah, look, it's a fair question. I didn't mean to gloss over it like it's not important. It's just that I've been... Yeah, look, yeah, so have I. Look, I mean, back in the 80s, we lived next to a place that, and there weren't standards, but now that there are relevant standards, and this is the feedback that I've received from our environmental consultant, that generally speaking, and traditionally, that nowadays, if they are built and constructed to the Australian standards, which they need to be as part of the construction requirements for building approval, that there should be no odour. That the Australian standards will manage to achieve that. Now, I believe that we could, we'd be happy to accept a condition that required us to provide that odour report that could address those issues. The environmental consultant believes that there's no chance that we couldn't comply, that we could easily address that. And as I said, there's other approvals where things like lighting and odour have been conditions, and I think we can quite easily do that. Yeah.
Councillors, have any more questions for Andrew? No? Thanks very much, Andrew.
No problem.
Yep, yeah, just, so we're ready to reinstate standing orders. Officers, are you comfortable? Yep. Reinstate by Councillor Jeff, second by Councillor Tim. Those in favour? Okay. Councillors, we have this application before us. Is there anyone prepared to move as per the officer's report?
Could I move an alternative?
Yes.
I'd like to move that it be approved on the basis that waste access, odour and acoustic report conditions are put in place to ensure that we get an appropriate outcome around those issues.
Okay, I'll just defer to the officers for some advice there.
Councillors, if there is an appetite to approve this development, then we would recommend that the consideration of this application be deferred, because there would need to be a set of conditions developed to support an approval, and that would take some time. So it would not be till sometime in the new year that would be able to be undertaken. So it would need to be brought to a meeting probably February or March.
I'm happy to move that then, that it be deferred, and that there be good communication between both parties to ensure that everybody's on the same page. And
okay, so hang on. We've got to move. I need a seconder. Councillor Melissa.
Well, that's just a defer, isn't it?
Yes.
No, nothing else, just a defer.
Just a
Thank
deferral. You. And let's be clear, it's the deferral is specifically for...
If there's an appetite to approve, then we would suggest that there be a deferral of consideration of this application. It be brought back to a subsequent meeting. The officer's recommendation would remain the same, but it would give councillors the opportunity to move the alternate motion that the application be approved, and you would have a full set of conditions that would be provided to whichever council asks for it, that would support an approval.
So that's why I wanted to clarify, Councillor Nancy. We can't ask officers to change their recommendation because that's not appropriate, but we can request some
and
conditions.
The conditions that have been raised here as issues today are the ones that be addressed. that we don't introduce new, are we going to introduce new additional conditions other than the ones that have been identified as an issue today?
Councillors, there would be standard conditions which would be applied to this type of development, so it would be around a whole range of issues.
And that, my understanding is it's a standard suite of conditions. Yeah. Councillor Kerry, yeah.
You mentioned, I think, that if we have an appetite to approve, what if we don't have an appetite, but we're happy to defer it or something? You know, I just don't like that. I don't like that inference.
Councillor, I guess the response was in relation to a suggestion that this be approved or a motion be moved to approve it, and our recommendation that if you're going to move a motion to approve it, then it should be accompanied by a set of conditions that we would need to prepare on councillors' behalf.
So,
Mr Chair, can I just say,
hang on a
wouldn't
sec.
that be a new application?
Hang on a sec. I wanted to clarify. We have an amended or a new motion that it be deferred.
Yeah.
So there is opportunity at that time when it comes back to council for us to debate that, unless there's an appetite to make an amendment on the amended motion that we go into debate now.
Well, we can debate this now.
Yeah, or you're open to debate it now if you want. Well, I've already accepted a mover and a seconder for this new motion.
And we can debate this.
We've got two councillors away.
My
question to you, Mr Chair, is if this stays like that it is, then the motion comes back for complete reconsideration. Thank you. That's what I was asking. A complete reconsideration of the motion and the decision. Thank you.
Are we clear? Yes. So
we're happy. You want to debate it now?
That's
just
totally up to you.
Could I just have a question, please, Nancy? The issue here is that this doesn't have all of the conditions. That's the issue. There are no conditions attached to this because it was, as an officer's recommendation, to refuse it. Therefore, would there be conditions already done up, or there's no conditions? You've got to a point and said, well, the recommendation is to refuse it. So therefore, it's difficult for us to approve it without conditions. That's what we'd be doing.
Yeah.
So this is the only option for us to do that. And I would suggest that perhaps in the future, we should still have conditions. And I don't know how that works, if that's additional work, but it makes it difficult for councillors to actually have an alternate view by majority if conditions aren't there, because this is now going to delay this for another month, 2 months, and we've got applicants, we've got people in the room who've been waiting some time for a decision. Good, bad, in their favour, doesn't matter. So there will be a level of frustration here. So it's a note that I'd like taken on board if we could, CEO, so that we can somehow deal with this at that time.
Councillors, I guess officers don't, for every application that comes to council, prepare a motion each way. That would be a significant impost on the resourcing for council officers. We prepare a recommendation which is based on professional opinion and viewpoint. You know, councillors have the prerogative to make a different decision. Where possible, if that's going to be the case, then it is great to have notification in advance that that's potentially going to be the case. To be honest, it's a lot easier for us to, at short notice, assist councillors in preparing grounds for refusal, because that's simpler and they're more compact, than it is to prepare a suite of conditions for approval. That takes some time. So if we were to do that for every potential application where we were recommending a refusal, that is just a huge significant impost on council officers' resources.
And Councillor Jeff, to be fair to the officers, their job is to put a professional recommendation. They can't read how this room will interpret that. So I think that we need to be mindful and make a bit of allowance there. It's not as clean cut as we'd all like it to be sometimes. So, Councillor Nancy.
Thank you, Chair, and I agree wholeheartedly. However, it's important for the staff to understand that we as councillors don't make up our final decision until we've heard all the debate around the room. So I've often come in here with a view that I may vote a particular way and the debate has changed my mind, and to me that's healthy debate. And so we can never know for sure which way we're going to vote either until...
Well, that's all I'm saying is the officers, it's not the officers predict how council will make a determination. Their responsibility is to put their recommendation forward. So where we sit now is their recommendation won't change. There'll be a suite of conditions listed for us. We'll come back in the new year at a special meeting, and then there will be discussion and the opportunity for debate as per the officer's recommendation. Yeah. Well, if you're happy to test the room now, we'll vote on that deferral. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, councillors, can I just clarify that if there is a deferral today, what officers would do, and if it's Councillor Summerfield that would like at a future meeting to move an alternate motion, then we would prepare a suite of conditions. We would provide them to Councillor Summerfield. She could distribute them as she wishes and then move her alternate motion. Because it's not officers moving a motion for approval or presenting a recommendation for approval. It's councillors indicating they would like to move an alternate motion for approval. So we're happy to prepare a suite of conditions and provide those if it's Councillor Summerfield that would like to move the alternate motion in the future to do so, and then she can distribute them as she would like to other councillors.
Yeah, sorry, didn't do well at explaining that, but anyway. So, Councillor Campbell.
Comment, thank you. I think it's very out of order to send anything to one councillor. It should be sent to all councillors. Thank you.
Well, that's fine. I'm sure the officers are happy to do that. That'd be pretty standard.
We can CC the other councillors in.
Okay. So, are we clear? The alternate motion, that's what we're voting on? Yep. There's a mover and seconder there. Okay.
No, the alternate motion's underneath, Danielle. Yeah.
No, because it's not.
Just in regard to this, there's no, I thought I read somewhere that there was a time frame.
No, we were
Was
just...
that the next one?
We were just discussing that. That's what the CEO just asked. There's no...
Councillors, this is not a situation where there's a risk of deemed approval. It's an impact assessable application, therefore it is open, for it to be decided at a later time.
Okay, councillors, let's move to the vote. Are those would you like to sum up? Sorry.
No, I'm just happy that we put that council defer the matter to a future special meeting before March 2023.
23. Okay, those in favour of that motion? Those against? That's carried. Would you like your vote recorded, Councillor Carey? Councillor Carroll? Yes? Okay. Oh. Okay, councillors, we need to keep going. Suspension of standing orders again. Councillor Jeff, Councillor Carroll, those in favour? That's carried. So we've suspended standing orders for item 8, a material change of use development application for development permit for a...
He's had to leave, sorry. Yeah, we're down 3. Yeah, sorry, councillor Bill. Councillor Tim has had to leave.
Okay.
Thank you.
Change of use for a food and drink outlet located at 360A to 360B Bridge Street, Wilsonton. And Jayden is going to present this one as well.
Thank you, Chair. This might feel a bit like deja vu. Much of the same matters that were raised in the last one are going to be presented once again, so I'll try and summarise where I can. So this application is for a standalone material change of use for a food and drink outlet, and this is at 360A and 360B Bridge Street. Again, this is in the low medium density residential zone, urban residential precinct. The site comprises 2 lots, which contains a dwelling house and a multiple dwelling with 3 units in it. The total area of the subject site is 2,574 square metres. This site is opposite the Wilsonton Major Centre and adjoins a dwelling house to the west, a healthcare services dentist use to the east, and the Toowoomba City Aerodrome to the south. And an aerial overview is provided in attachments 3 and 4. Once again, could I please get attachment 5 up just with an overview of the proposed development? This is for a single building located centrally within the site with a maximum height of 6 metres above ground level, a gross floor area of 269 square metres and outdoor dining of 36 square metres. An area of open car parking is proposed to the east of the building containing 15 car parking spaces with a single drive-through lane to the west with queuing for 10 vehicles. Vehicular access is proposed via left-in, left-out at Bridge Street, and it is proposed to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The proposal includes acoustic treatments along multiple property boundaries, including a acoustic barrier 1.8 metres in height along the full eastern boundary, which adjoins the healthcare services use, and a combination of 2 acoustic barriers 2.2 metres in height adjacent to the western drive-through lane. In addition to that, a parallel 1.8 metre high acoustic barrier further along the western side boundary, which adjoins the dwelling house. This is subject impact assessment, was referred to the State Assessment Referral Agency, again as Bridge Street is a state controlled road, and a response was received with conditions. There was a single properly made submission received during the public notification period which opposed the development. And the matters raised in this submission include concerns regarding the generation of excess traffic, noise generated by the development, whether there is a need for further fast food outlets within the locality, and whether there is an overriding need for the retention of the existing dwellings over non-residential development in the current housing market. The proposed development is considered to conflict with several assessment benchmarks within the scheme, again at a high level. It represents out-of-centre commercial development in a residential zone, and there has been no clearly demonstrated community, economic or planning need to establish the development at this site. The purpose and overall outcomes of the low medium density zone code form the main basis of non-compliance for this application. This comes down to the intensity of the use and proximity to an adjoining sensitive receptor. And then the findings within the Economic Need and Impact Analysis report, which is prepared by Foresight Partners, together with the arguments presented by the applicant, have not assisted in demonstrating compliance with the purpose and overall outcomes, and no relevant matters have been presented to support the development otherwise. Once again, I would raise the 4 key matters presented in our assessment, which is the servicing of the day-to-day needs of the immediate local residential community, acknowledging that it singularly would not materially undermine the viability of the Wilsonton Major Centre. However, cumulatively, it would serve to further undermine the long-term viability and primacy of the Wilsonton Major Centre. The presence of alternate sites within the Wilsonton Major Centre, and then a lack of site-specific criteria that justify locating the development outside of the Wilsonton Major Centre on the southern side of Bridge Street. On balance, the application is recommended for refusal on the basis that it does not comply with the aforementioned assessment benchmarks, and on balance, the positive aspects and benefits of the development have not been found to outweigh the inconsistencies within the planning scheme and the adverse impacts. Thank you.
Question, Councillor Nancy?
Mr Chair, based on arguments for the previous case, I believe that we have a very similar case here, and this one is even closer to the one we approved only a couple of months ago, just nearly diagonally opposite on that other corner, on the corner of Richmond and Bridge Street. This one definitely backs right onto the airport, and I actually would encourage councillors to consider deferring this one as well on the same basis.
So councillors, how do you feel about that? We go out of standing orders to actually have to do that? Yep. I just want to give the applicant an opportunity to...
We're going to defer the applicant. We'll have an opportunity in early next year to do it.
Okay.
And I think
Righto. I'm here and I'm reading the room. Yep. Councillor Paul will do that. Righto. So could I have someone, Councillor Nancy, Councillor Melissa, move out of standing orders, back to standing orders? The ayes have it, yes? Okay, so would someone like to move that? Are we clear on that motion? Yep.
Yep, that council defer the matter to a future...
Councillor Nancy would like to move, a seconder. Councillor Melissa, those in favour? That's carried. Thank you, councillors. Thanks, members of the gallery, officers, for your patience. And I'd like to wish, since how this is the last special meeting, wish you a very happy, safe Christmas and a prosperous New Year. Thanks.